There may be slight delays as we transition between speakers' presentations and participants. If any participants have issues with the technology, not believe we have any members of the public signed up to comment today. Can the moderator verify this?
Confirm we don't have anyone that's not on an item.
Moving on to committee report. Item C.1, the Infrastructure and Mobility Committee had planned to discuss the Comprehensive Plan Amendment CP 1121 at their November 18th scheduled meeting. However, the meeting was canceled when a quorum was not reached. As currently defined in the staff report, the request is inconsistent with the 2030 Comprehensive Plan, and the Planning Commission deadline for action is February 16, 2022. We have a few options to move forward on this case. This is outlined on the agenda. The Planning Commission can choose to move this item to the next Infrastructure and Mobility Committee meeting, which would occur on January 27th. We can remove this item from committee and discuss it at a future full Planning Commission meeting. That next meeting would be December 14th. Or we can remove this item from committee and discuss at the November 23rd meeting, which is today. I'm going to, before I take a show of hands for a vote, I'm going to ask if the applicant is on the line and there are any time constraints associated with this amendment.
I believe we have the applicant on the
Thank
line
you.
for CP 11. JP.
Erin Catlett is the applicant. If you could unmute her.
All right.
Hi, good morning. Yes, we would like to move forward as soon as possible with this. We had applied for this back in August, and just, obviously with everything going on with the constraints of COVID have been pushed all the way till now here in November. So the sooner we can move forward, the better.
Thank you for that. So by show of hands, I'm going to ask us to vote. This is not a final disposition on a case, so we don't need to have a motion. Before I take that show of hands vote, Committee Chair Bennett, do you have anything to add?
Thank you, Chair Fox. I just want to be as fair to the applicant and to members of the public as we can. They showed up last week and we weren't prepared to move forward. So if we can hear it today with the other one being deferred, if that frees up time for us to hear it today, then I'm fine with that. If not, then I would be good with moving it to our next Planning Commission meeting. I'm not opposed to moving it back to committee, but I'm a little uncertain now about having quorum, and I would hate for the applicant to return at the end of January and we still aren't able to hear it.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Okay, so our first item, just by show of hands, this first option, keep the item in the committee and have it discussed at the January 27 meeting. By show of hands, who supports that option? Okay, seeing no hands on that. I'm going to ask the second option is removing the item from committee and discussing it at our December 14 meeting. Any of those in support of that option? Got 1, 2, 3. All right. And then the last option is remove this item from committee and discuss it today at our meeting. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Excellent. So at this point, we can move to that item. I don't know, Committee Chair Bennett, if you'd like to introduce the item.
I was not prepared for that, but if you give me
worries.
just a second, I will pull up what I had. Do you want to do something else while I do that? I'm sorry, I didn't.
No worries. I can kick it off. CP 1121 is a proposed amendment to the comprehensive plan. This item would change the streets map, the Chapel Hill Road street plan. It's a privately initiated amendment to map T1 in the street plan. The proposal would remove a segment of a proposed 2-lane avenue undivided from Chapel Hill Road to a proposed extension of Edwards Mill Road designated as a 4-lane divided avenue. Again, this item had been on the agenda for November 18, Infrastructure and Mobility Committee agenda, but it was not discussed at that time. So we will start off with a staff presentation by JP Mansell.
Good morning. As Chair Fox said, CP11 is a privately initiated amendment to map T1 street plan, and that would remove a proposed Avenue 2 lane undivided from the street plan map. That proposed street runs from Chapel Hill Road to a proposed extension of Edwards Mill Road. And this would essentially eliminate the requirement that this road be dedicated and constructed if any of the parcels on which it is mapped were redeveloped through a site plan or subdivision. And that the deadline for action is February 16th next year. So just for some context, this is what an Avenue 2 lane undivided would look like if it were constructed. There would be two 11-foot vehicle travel lanes and bike lanes and sidewalks on either side of the street. Here's an aerial surrounding the proposed street, which is in the dashed red line. The properties implicated by the proposed street are currently industrial use, and to the east and west are also some additional industrial uses. South of the railroad, shown in black, are a mix of residential housing types and a commercial shopping center at the corner of Jones Franklin and Western Boulevard. The proposed extension of Edwards Mill is shown in yellow on this map, just kind of defining where that proposed street would, where the amendment would end. And so while this is just an amendment to the street plan, I do want to provide some additional land use and transportation context for the area, as there have been several past plans and proposals that sort of influence the current policy that exists today. So looking at the current zoning, north of the railroad, the zoning is predominantly industrial, reflecting the current and historic use of the area. South of the railroad is largely mixed use along Western and Hillsborough, and also transitioning to residential zoning further south. The future land use map shows a different picture, so largely envisioning this area transitioning to mixed use and residential development with a public facilities designation on the state-owned property to the north. And these designations are sort of largely reflective of a future that previously included a light rail stop directly in this area, but that light rail, as we all know, was never developed, and these future land uses still kind of reflect that that plan. There's currently a proposal underway that would run commuter rail from Durham to potentially Johnson County that would utilize the rail line directly to the south of the site. The current stops are currently proposed at Corporate Center Drive, which is 3/4 of a mile to the west, and Blue Ridge Road, which is just over a mile away to the east, which suggests that the mixed use future proposed by the future land use map that would have been supported by that light rail plan is a little less likely to occur without a closer commuter rail stop. Looking at the urban form map, the implicated properties are located in a transit station area and core transit area due to their proximity to a potential bus rapid transit station at the intersection of Jones Franklin and Western. And while that site is technically within a 1/4 mile of the future BRT, there are some functional limitations in the railroad and lack of street connections that would sort of prevent walkability from this site to the future BRT. Also relevant to this amendment are some recommendations that came out of the Raleigh Cary Railroad Crossing Study completed in 2017. And this study looked at grade railroad crossings along the North Carolina Railroad corridor between Raleigh and Cary, which runs to the south of the site. One of the recommendations was an extension of Jones Franklin Road that would have made a connection to the proposed street that this amendment is proposing to remove. Again, shown here in red is the proposed street. And to implement the recommendations of that study, several amendments were proposed in CP 417. The majority of those recommendations were approved, but this Jones-Franklin connection was denied. Council at the time cited the impacts to local businesses if this extension were to be constructed, and also felt that the Western BRT alignment needed to be nailed down a little bit further before this connection was adopted as policy. And so if the Jones-Franklin Road extension were adopted, the proposed street we are discussing today would have provided a direct connection to that future BRT service. But because that extension was denied, there currently isn't a convenient and walkable connection between the proposed street and the street network to the south, including that future BRT station. Council did indicate at the time of denial that this extension may be more ripe for consideration with future study of this area. And if this amendment is denied and the proposed street remain on the map, it may be worth considering looking at this Jones-Franklin connection and potentially the future land use in this area in future planning work, whether that be with Western BRT station area planning or as a standalone comprehensive plan amendment. And so looking at going back to the request, looking at the policy analysis, the request is inconsistent with the 2030 comprehensive plan. There are two consistent policies that mostly speak to retaining industrial uses in locations that are appropriate for industrial uses, which this location is given its access to highways and lack of adjacent residential uses that could be impacted by the industrial uses here. Removing that street connection would make the retention of those industrial uses more viable as they redevelop. The request is inconsistent with policies that talk about coordinating land use and transportation. So the Avenue 2 lane as proposed would provide a smaller block pattern, more walkable transportation network, and would support the mixed use and higher density residential future land use designations that currently exist. Removing an additional potential street connection is also inconsistent with policy T2.3, which recommends expanding connections and promoting better accessibility of uses. The site is also within the Arena Blue Ridge area specific guidance. And while there aren't any site-specific policies for this site, there is a general policy about providing additional street connections that this request would be inconsistent with. There are no outstanding issues, and again, your deadline is February 16th.
Thank you so much. Next, I'd like to hear from the applicant team. The applicant and those in support have 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning, commissioners. My name is Erin Catlett, and I am with Fox Rothschild, located at 434 Fayetteville Road, Suite 2800 in Raleigh. Joining me is my colleague, Clyde Holt, and we are here on behalf of the applicant, the Fred Smith Company, located at 6105 Chapel Hill Road in Raleigh. Also with us today is Brent Wood with the Fred Smith Company and Johnny Edwards with John and Edwards and Company, and they are available to answer questions that you may have. As JP has already shared, the Fred Smith Company submitted a comprehensive plan amendment petition to remove a portion of the proposed road from the MAP T1 street plan. You can go to the next slide. Each of you should have received a letter sent via email from Clyde and myself earlier this month outlining the Fred Smith Company's petition for the amendment. In their presentation just now, staff did a great job of providing the background on the petition, and we'd like to spend just a couple of minutes highlighting a few points from our letter. Go to the next slide. On the screen now is the same aerial map we provided in the letter and very similar to the one JP just provided. The red dashed line represents the proposed road that we are requesting be removed from the street plan. The Fred Smith Company parcel is outlined in red, and again to the north is Chapel Hill Road or Highway 54, and to the south is the North Carolina Railroad and the Hillsborough Street. As you can see, the red dashed line would bisect the Fred Smith Company parcel, as well as our neighbors along this corridor. The Fred Smith Company has used this parcel for both office and heavy equipment maintenance since 2011, and for decades prior to that, it was used in the same capacity by C.C. Mangum. The Fred Smith Company is looking to expand its office due to a growing workforce, and it would like to relocate the heavy equipment maintenance shop on the parcel, but will essentially be keeping the use the same. Under the current street plan, the Fred Smith Company may not expand its office and relocate the maintenance shop without dedication of this right-of-way for the road, forcing subdivision of the lot and limiting our redevelopment options on the parcel. If you look closely, you'll notice that the red dashed line cuts through numerous structures and communication towers, both on our parcel as well as others in its path. You can go to the next slide. This is another view from Google Earth that gives you a bit more of an idea of the structures that would be impacted by the road. Again, the road's not on this map here, but if you can imagine that same dashed line running through the middle of these parcels, there to the left, you can see the L-shaped Fred Smith Company parcel, and it would run kind of right through where that mark where the Fred Smith Company is marked. Continuing to the east, through the parcel with the communication towers, and then cutting through buildings on the next two parcels, and then through the middle of the asphalt plant on the furthest east parcel there. Not only does the proposed road path cause disruption and damage to numerous structures along its path, it also severs these parcels, forcing subdivision. The proposed road discourages and even prohibits these industrial owners from meaningful expansion of their properties. You can go to the next slide. We discussed these concerns with the City Planning Department in early 2021 when we met with city officials regarding our proposed site plan for redevelopment. Those meetings continued into the spring and summer with various staff. We met with David York and Robin Tatum in the City Attorney's Office and Eric Lamb with Transportation Planning Department. All agreed the best path forward was for Fred Smith to pursue the amendment to remove this segment of the proposed road from the street plan. We are thankful for the support of staff as we petition for this amendment. This proposed road was added to the street plan at a time when light rail was anticipated, as JP shared earlier, along this corridor. And thus the corridor was envisioned to redevelop into residential and mixed use and needed more street connectivity. However, the light rail plans are no longer appear viable. And even though bus rapid transit and commuter rail lines are being considered in its place, even staff finds it unlikely that this particular corridor will see redevelopment into residential and mixed use. So while we understand removing this road may be considered inconsistent with parts of the comprehensive plan related to the envisioned future land use, the reality is the land use along this corridor has remained unchanged, and it continues to be industrial, making this proposed road unnecessary. Our general statutes allow for development and change, even where inconsistent with the comprehensive plan, when there's good reason to make the change. And here there is good reason to make the change. While the proposed road may have been justified at the time when redevelopment into residential and mixed use was probable, the continued industrial uses along this corridor do not support the proposed road any longer. Removal of this proposed road is also consistent with the comprehensive plan, as JP shared, in concentrating these industrial uses in an area buffered from residential. Additionally, this particular industrial corridor is conveniently located near major highways, specifically Interstate 40 and the railroad, making it an ideal location for industrial use. The industrial uses on these parcels are providing meaningful job opportunities in the area, as well as contributions to the county and city tax base. We believe removing the proposed road from the street plan is advantageous to the property owners, the community, and the city of Raleigh. Clyde, would you like to add anything? Not sure if he's not on mute, but he can pipe in here in a minute. You can go to the last slide. We want to thank you for your time and consideration for this petition to remove this segment of the road. Should you have any questions, Clyde and I are here and happy to answer anything. And we also, again, have Brent Wood and Johnny Edwards from JCO available if you have any questions.
Thank you. I just want to verify with the moderator that we do not have any members of the public signed up to speak on this item.
Correct, just the applicant team.
Okay. Then I'd like to allow for questions and comments from commissioners. I'll start off asking for a clarification. This might be Mr. Bauer's question. I know we've talked at length about the dashed lines that show up in the comprehensive plan and what their impact might be. And as we've discussed previously, there's no impact to the property owner when they keep their business running and in operation as it currently exists. However, this one with the proposal for a renovation obviously met some threshold by which they needed to dedicate right of way. Can you clarify what that threshold of improvement is?
Off the top of my head, I believe it's related to what tier of site plan you're in. And I believe you have to be in at least a tier 1, maybe a tier, no, not tier 1, a tier 2 or a tier 3 in order for that to kick in. So minor changes to the property would not do that. Major changes would be sufficient to trigger dedication if you were in one of those upper site plan tiers. I'm not familiar enough with the case of what was happening with the Fred Smith property specifically to know what the trigger was, but typically if you're continuing to operate your business and simply maintaining the use and maintaining the structures and buildings on it, it would not trigger that. Only when a more significant change to the property was proposed would it be triggered.
Okay. Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair Fox. So it sounds like the proposal is inconsistent with the comprehensive plan because the comprehensive plan envisioned this area as mixed-use residential, which is not likely any longer. Therefore, it's really not inconsistent with what is likely to happen in the comprehensive plan. Is that right? In a convoluted, it's inconsistent technically, but not in reality.
I would say it's inconsistent with what is currently in the comprehensive plan in terms of removing street connections, transportation policies related to that, and also that street connection, if this were to redevelop into a higher density and more mixed use type area, would facilitate a more walkable street pattern. So with as it stands now with the policies in the comprehensive plan is inconsistent. But it may be, you may deem it reasonable based on the context in historic planning that never came to fruition.
Okay, thank you.
So to clarify, just to tag on to that, it is inconsistent with currently adopted policy in the comprehensive plan, but not inconsistent with current understandings of transit planning. Is that,
You said that more eloquently than I did.
I had time to write notes while you were talking. Is that an accurate statement? I just want to verify that. JP?
I think the reasonableness of it, I think, is for the commission to decide. I think with the adopted policies in the plan, in removing a street connection is inconsistent with those. If that's helpful.
That's helpful. Thank you. Thank you. Are there any additional questions or comments from commissioners?
Just like to
Sure.
clarify, it was tier 3 is the only tier.
That requires, Ken, since you piped in with the clarification, I just wanted to ask as well. At that point, it's a parcel that's almost landlocked, and the road connection goes through it in a manner where it's not connecting to anything. Yet, it would be interpreted to be required to do that easement and dedication at the time of site plan. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Right.
So you are correct that you would end up with a street segment that doesn't connect anything on either end. And it
Okay.
would await such time as adjacent properties came in and redeveloped and were also required to do some more dedication, or the city came in and acquired the right of way to do so.
Thank you. Commissioner O'Haver, I saw your hand.
Thank you, Chair Fox. A couple of questions. on the staff presentation where they had the slide up on where they're removing it, it looks like the Avenue 2-lane undivided continues to the west. In all of their graphics, they're really just kind of showing the line that, you know, cuts across from the Edwards Mill extension. So again, the whole, is that, well, I guess, is that accurate? That proposed T1 map continues past. And again, our famous dashed lines, I mean, should we consider the entire road because it's the same condition on the other side? I don't know. I mean, I think we've done that before on previous dash line discussions. So that's one thought. And then the second thing is, it would seem silly to dedicate right away just on that landlocked piece. But ultimately, aren't there going to be, if this were to develop into a higher density use, aren't there going to be block perimeter requirements that will continue to connect the street network through there?
Yes and no. One of the issues is that you can run perpendicular streets to the railroad and stub them into the railroad. The railroad is considered right of way for purposes of defining block perimeter. So if you have right of way that goes into the railroad, clearly a railroad crossing is something that is typically too difficult for a private developer to take on for anything other than the most massive project. So you meet that type of physical interruption is considered being able to form part of a block. And so I think block perimeter would not necessarily get you a cross street in this location, depending on how you routed your perpendicular streets.
Do you have an additional question, Commissioner O'Haver?
Oh, sorry. I mean, I'm looking at the graphic here and I understand the intent of being able to do some, you know, more urban sized blocks along here. And I think if this whole area were to be purchased and higher density or, you know, start to be developed, then I think that street network would naturally occur. And then I'm still curious about what the thoughts are on the dash line to the west.
Commissioner O'Haver, you are correct that there is a dash line that continues past the proposed Edwards Mill extension. That was not a part of this amendment, and if it were to be, there would have to be an amendment to the application and then additional analysis that would include the other part of that proposed street.
Certainly don't want that. I guess just, we've talked about this previously and y'all know these dash lines are a thorn in my side. So just pointing out that we're going to run into the same issue to the west, but maybe it's not for us to discuss at this time.
Commissioner O'Haver, I agree with your assessment there, but I'd also like to acknowledge notification didn't go out to neighbors on the remaining portion to the west. So we might want to defer that to a different time. Did I see an additional hand up? Oh, Mr. York?
Yes, just to give you a little bit of history, since we were involved in a meeting prior to them filing this application. I think in the discussion with Eric Lamb, because the dotted line extending to the west of the Edwards Mill Road extension is a short step to connect to Germantown, there was a thought that that might redevelop as opposed to the subject property, and that leaving that dash line would be appropriate until those property owners wanted to consider removing it.
That all makes sense. I'm sorry I brought it up. Let's move on and focus on what we need to focus on.
Thank you, sir. Did I have an additional hand up? Did I see Commissioner Rains?
Thanks, Chair Fox. And this may be a conversation for another day, but if we consider removing this dash line for these properties on the specific case, how does that affect the future land use map, if at all? Because those are still pointing toward medium density in office and residential. So I don't know how or if that's something that we need to talk about in a committee meeting, a separate date. If Zach has any thoughts on that, I'd like to hear it.
proposed amendment as it stands is just for the street plan, so no changes would be made to the future land use map. As a part of future land use planning, it may be something to look at, but as of now with this request, that would not change. The future land use map would not change.
Were there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Okay, seeing none, it does seem like there's a larger conversation about the dashed lines in general that we might want to refer to a committee. That would most likely end up being in the Infrastructure and Mobility Committee. I see a head nod from Commissioner Bennett, who will smile and very nicely take that item. But in terms of the issue we have at hand today, so the specific to the parcel, and then that specific removal of the roadway segment, do commissioners have enough information to move forward at this time? Okay, Commissioner O'Haver.
Can you, sorry if I missed it at the beginning, but why were we considering to kick it back to committee?
No, the item we will discuss and vote on today, the larger item of the dashed lines per your comment would be talked about in depth at a future time.
Yeah, I meant when we voted at the beginning on whether or not to hear this and what the impact of the delay would be if we sent it back to committee versus hearing it at full commission. What was the catalyst for that discussion? I mean, it seems like, I guess the point, it seems like I've got plenty of information, so I'm just trying to, what am I missing?
No, we are going to hear a vote for the item today. A larger issue unrelated to this case, but with an overlapping concept of the dashed lines, will be heard in the committee. So this specific case, this specific comprehensive plan amendment, I would like to entertain a motion right now.
Right. Sorry, let me just ask it one more time. I'm probably not phrasing my question correctly. This specific case, CP 1121, we voted before we even started the discussion around CP 1121.
No, sir. So this item was scheduled to be on an agenda. We did not have a quorum for that committee meeting, so that item had to be moved out for timing purposes. That's what we were voting on, sir.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Miller, I saw your hand up.
Thank you. I move to recommend adoption of the proposed consistency statement dated November 23rd, 2021, contained in the agenda materials, and to recommend approval of CP 1121.
And do I have a second? Commissioner Rains?
Second.
Commissioner Miller has offered a motion to approve CP 1121. Commissioner Rains has offered a second. Is there any other discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Okay, seeing none, I will ask Shanitha for a roll call of members to record their individual votes. And at the end of the roll call, I will announce the outcome of the vote.
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Dartell?
Aye.
Commissioner Elder?
Aye.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Godinez?
Aye.
Commissioner Lampman?
Aye.
Vice Chairman?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver?
Aye.
And Commissioner Rains?
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously. All right, moving on to the remainder of committee report. We have two items, report out from the Strategic Planning Committee, which met on November 17th and discussed the American Rescue Plan Act funding and applicability of infill comprehensive plan policies. These items are provided as information in the backup material. No action is required. I'll hand over to Committee Chair Lampman if you have any comment to add.
Thank you. It was a great meeting. And I appreciate all the effort that is put forth by the Planning Department and the Planning Commission to support these topics that we research in greater detail. As mentioned, one of the topics was the American Rescue Plan Act funding. I encourage everyone to take a look at the PDF that was provided there. Good summary of the funds that were allocated to the city of Raleigh and what is remaining and how that might be spent. I am reporting this to the Planning Commission for information purposes only. We have no recommendation and no action required. We also discussed the applicability of infill comprehensive plan policies as provided by the Planning Department to support the Planning Commission in their efforts of deciding cases. Again, there's no action on this particular item, and the committee is reporting this item to the Planning Commission without recommendation.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, there are no consent agenda or old business items today. So moving on to new business. We have 6 remaining items as 1 item was already deferred, currently listed under the new business portion of the agenda. These requests have not appeared on a previous Planning Commission agenda, and we will hear a full staff presentation and applicant presentation, and we will take public comment. Item D.1 is TC 1521 towing yards. This is a request to modify Part 10 of the Unified Development Ordinance to allow vehicle towing yards in the IX district with a special use permit. It also modifies applicable use standards. This item has not been previously discussed, so we will start with a staff presentation from Keegan McDonald.
Thank you. Good morning. This is Keegan McDonald. If you could go to the next slide. So a little bit of an overview and history for the Planning Commission's benefit. This is an external text change request, and the applicant, I believe, is available and has signed up to make comment and answer any questions once I conclude my presentation. In general, it's looking to modify allowances and requirements for towing yards for vehicles, which is a principal use. It was referred to, by the City Council to the Council's Transportation and Transit Committee on May 18th, 2021, and then was discussed in that committee. The committee at that point did make some recommend some changes to the draft ordinance, which have been incorporated, and I'll get into those when I provide an overview of those changes. It also was paired with a larger discussion around predatory towing, and so that's why it went to the committee in the first place. Ultimately, the committee recommended it be authorized, which was done in August. The recommendation, was made at their August meeting, and then it was formally authorized in September. Next slide, please. So the current regulations require a special use permit for this use, and that comes with approval by the Board of Adjustment. So there has to be a case made and an evidentiary hearing before the board. It is only permitted, even with that special use permit, in the heavy industrial zoning district. There's also a 1 mile spacing requirement from other tow yards, so no 2 tow yards can be within 1 mile of each other. It also requires street and transitional protective yards, so those are along the right-of-way and then along any adjoining property line. It also states that it can only be used for vehicle storage and not the sale of parts or whole vehicles. Next slide, please. The proposed modifications would expand the districts where this use is allowed to the IX district. It would still require a special use permit. The changes also propose removing the spacing requirement, so eliminating that 1 mile distance. It would also prohibit the use within proximity of a major street. So this particular change was added by the council and the council committee. And this was intended to protect major corridors where they believe there could be future transit infrastructure and improvements such that there's not a concentration of towing yards along those corridors where we'd want to incentivize and or mandate other types of uses. The other change that's added is limiting vehicular surface area and vehicle storage yards within 150 feet of any residential district or residential use. Next slide, please. These next few images will just show the extent of the various districts and also existing towing yards. So this first slide shows the extent of heavy industrial zoning, which is fairly limited throughout the city. Next slide, please. This shows the buffers for existing tow yards. So there is some overlap today, and that's due to existing facilities that may have preceded these specific requirements. But as you can see, they're fairly limited, particularly within the city of Raleigh's jurisdiction. Next slide, please. This slide shows the extent of the IX district, that's industrial mixed use. So this is actually one of the most predominant mixed use zoning districts within the city. So it would significantly increase the amount of land available to site one of these towing yards, but again, would still require a special use permit and any applicant or operator to go through that process with the Board of Adjustment. Next slide, please. This shows just the overlap of IX, IH, and the existing towing facilities. So there actually are a few towing facilities that are tenured and do exist within the IX district. But as you can see, that there's a number of those. And so they've actually tended to accumulate in some areas where we've already designated that IX zoning district. So it would, in essence, be following suit with sort of the natural allotment of these particular uses and businesses. Next slide, please. I did want to go over some of the impacts that came up when we initially reviewed this application, particularly noise and traffic. It's understandable that that could occur. And so those two criteria were part of the desire of staff and also the council to impose restrictions on proximity of the vehicular surface area or storage yard from any residential district or use. And another point to make clear is that through the special use permit process, these types of impacts are evaluated for each individual application. And through that process, the Board of Adjustment can impose conditions to ensure noise and traffic are properly mitigated. So each request would be reviewed on a case-by-case basis depending on where it sits. But we've also, as I noted, added use standards, which we think help to address those particular concerns. And then also with proximity to residential uses, there would be the required transitional protective yard, which is essentially a landscape and screening buffer along that shared property line, and then the minimum distance of 150 feet. It's also it also should be noted that many IX districts don't necessarily directly abut residential districts. There are, of course, residential districts and uses within proximity of some of those sites, but it's not particularly prevalent. And if so, again, the use standards and the SUP process, we believe, would properly help mitigate any impacts. So that concludes my presentation. As I mentioned, this is an external request, so the applicant is on the line, and I think they may have comment and also are available to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. I'd now like to allow the applicant and those in support to speak. They have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Fox. This is Tom Johnson. I am the applicant on this matter. I was approached by my client, Raleigh Towing, to pursue this ordinance amendment because, quite honestly, Raleigh Towing was having a hard time finding a location within the heavy industrial district because of the very limited opportunities that are out there. The Raleigh Police Department or the city requires that in order for a towing company to be on the rotation list for towing for the Raleigh Police Department, that it be located within the city limits of Raleigh. And so that, because the IH district is so limited within the city, it was creating a problem. It's creating a problem finding a location. It makes sense to allow this in IX with the restrictions, which we fully appreciate and agree with council's recommendation with respect to protecting major streets. But it does allow, say, tow yards to go into some existing industrial or IX developed districts that are sometimes light industrial warehousing type districts that now are not available. And it also is consistent with, as Keegan did a really good job showing where some of the existing tow yards exist. So I'm available to answer any questions, but this is what motivated it and would give that opportunity subject to a special use permit in the IX district, which obviously I think towing and tow yards are consistent with the IX district zoning.
Thank you, sir. Moderator, I just wanted to check, are there any members of the public who are signed up to speak on this item?
No signups.
Okay, excellent. Now we'll allow for questions and comments from commissioners. Do any members have any questions or comments? Commissioner Rains.
Thanks, Chair Fox. I don't have any objection to the IX use for towing. However, I would recommend under section C2E, where it says except property owned or occupied by the towing yard regarding residential. Hypothetically, they can purchase property outside and then have towing facilities up to that leased residential unit. So I would recommend striking that second part of the sentence on C2E.
And we would have no, this is Tom Johnson again, have no objection to that because we're fine with the buffering and wouldn't have any intent to have a residential structure there.
Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair Fox. So here's my concern. I actually don't think I have an objection to tow yards being in the IX district. My concern is if the reasoning is because of the limitation of heavy industrial zoning, what happens when another heavy industrial business says, we can't find any place to locate because heavy industrial zoning is so limited, can we go in the IX district? Then we get heavy industrial businesses all over the city. And it seems to defeat the purpose of having the heavy industrial zoning. So my concern is a little more about what this means for other heavy industrial businesses who may have difficulty locating. Why not just designate more areas as heavy industrial than moving them into the IX district?
Thank you for your question. Before staff answers that, want to also add, it might be helpful to distinguish what heavy industrial uses are typically from IX uses. So we can see if this particular use is more appropriate in one category versus the other.
Yeah, so the major distinctions between so-called light industrial uses and the heavy industrial uses really relate to how disruptive the uses are, the potential for noise, dust, vibration, fumes, amount, and outdoor storage, et cetera. So even uses like self-storage can be regulated differently between the two districts. If you want, we could give a more detailed enumeration. I wanted to give a little history of why there's very little IH zoning in the city and there's a lot of IX zoning. Prior to the adoption of the UDO, there were two industrial zones, IND1 and IND2. And they were almost exactly the same, except for IND1 had setbacks and IND2 did not. And huge swaths of the city were zoned industrial. In fact, a lot of Capitol Boulevard was zoned industrial, even though it was mostly developed for retail, because retail was a principal permitted use in the IND districts. And so you had all up and down Atlantic Avenue and Capitol, large swaths of industrial zoning that were mostly developed for shopping centers. So when we wrote the UDO, we created the IX district as a light industrial district. It is a kind of unique district because it does allow residential, but not on the ground floor. And that was kind of designed to facilitate, creative live-work arrangements. But the basic prototypical types of uses that you find in IX are sort of light vehicle repair, storage uses, light industrial flex parks, those sort of one-story buildings, and the larger, heavier stuff is in IH. City of Raleigh has very little heavy industrial use in it, and so when it came time to draw the zoning map to replace the IND districts with a mix of IX and IH, and in some cases CX, if it was primarily retail, a lot of that went to IX because of the fact that the use pattern was consistent with the IX zoning. And so IH was reserved for basically two types of locations, where there was a heavy industrial facility already operating or proposals to create an industrial park for that type of use. And that's mostly off of Auburn Church Road in the very southeastern section of Raleigh. So as a result, there's not a lot of IH zoning around the city. In terms of your question, is this setting a precedent for other modifications for things that are limited to IH? Obviously, every text change of this nature is a case-by-case basis. if you have a heavy industrial use and you want to locate it somewhere and you can't find a IH zone property to house it, you have two options. One option is to change the code. The other option is to rezone the property. I think for a lot of cases, it would be preferable to rezone the property because now you're looking at site-specific impacts that are limited to the property being rezoned. In a text change situation, if we took a text change and decided we were going to permit construction and debris landfills in the IX, for example, if that were a proposed text change that would come before you, you would have to consider what would be the impacts of allowing the construction and debris landfill throughout all these IX districts, which are extensively mapped across the city. And you might very well find that those impacts are unacceptable and suggest that the applicant pursue a rezoning instead if they feel like they have a site that is far enough away from residential to house a disruptive use like that. So I don't know if that gives you perfect guidance on this question, but I just wanted to talk about some history as to why there's a lot of IX, relatively little IH on the zoning map, what that means and how to weigh this text change. You have to look at it from the standpoint of, is this providing adequate protections where a towing and vehicle yard might impact adjacent residential? If you think that answer is yes, and in general you think this is compatible with the other types of uses that are found in an IX district, is it compatible with, a low-scale flex park of one-story buildings? Then you should be fine with it. If not, then I think you would still have questions. But that is the best way to think about it. This is obviously a broader text change. The applicant in this case has decided, instead of pursuing a rezoning, that they want to amend the code because they think that the current code requirements for location of towing yards are too restrictive. And they probably date back to the old IND zones and were carried forward and became much less available when the UDO was implemented through the remapping, because the amount of IH was much less than the IND that it had replaced. I hope that is somewhat of a useful history for you.
That was actually very helpful, Ken. Thank you.
Do we have any additional questions? Commissioner Lampman?
Sorry, I need to unmute. This is actually a timely text change. There was an accident just near my house the other day, and having to wait for the tow trucks. As we grow as a city, I think it makes sense that some of the infrastructure will need to bring closer to us. Some of these folks maybe don't have the means to go out and to find their car way outside of the city, and so I think that this is helpful. Ken, your description was also very helpful. So I appreciated that. I'm generally in support of this text change. The only question I had was when we looked at this, I appreciate the language stating that it's only for vehicle storage and no parts can be sold. Did we look at any issues with perhaps leaking cars or any sort of environmental impact? A lot of these cars, I'm sure, are damaged and are leaking quite a bit, but I don't know if there's any sort of environmental impact that we might want to look at in these areas.
This is Keegan. I'll respond and then let Justin Remetta fill in too if there was any discussion in the council committee, because he was the lead for that particular discussion. We did not discuss that specifically. I understand it could certainly be a concern. It's my understanding a lot of environmental type regulations are not typically included within the zoning ordinance because they're enforced by other agencies or entities. So it's not something we specifically looked at, but we're happy to investigate it if the commission so desires. And I'll defer to Justin too if he has any other comments to add.
I don't. I think Keegan summed it up accurately there. There was not discussion at the council.
My only thought on that particular item is, with water runoff and some impact, but I don't know what this industrial, existing industrial zoning, this might be somewhat compatible, but I could imagine that, with a significant rainfall, that there could be hazardous materials that could make their way into the storm system. I don't know the answer to that question, and so I will kind of defer to planning department to see if this could be a potential issue by allowing towing facilities in these areas that are closer to residential communities.
Madam Chair, if I may, this is Tom Johnson, the applicant. I mean, there would be existing environmental and stormwater runoff rules that we would have to meet. So we would have to meet those environmental requirements regardless. Even parking lots have those issues because of cars parking in there and maybe having leaks and things like that. I mean, but any of that, that's how we would address that. And of course, there's always a special use permit process. If there's a particular area of concern, it can be addressed in the special use permit process, and an additional condition could be placed on the use, or it could not be approved for a special use permit in a particular location. So I think those are where the protections lie. The type of areas that are of interest in terms of locating, and Commissioner Lampman's comments about proximity is very important. Proximity and location, one, being close by so residents can retrieve their vehicles or get service when an accident occurs. But the other part is, when you're going to retrieve your vehicle, you're much more comfortable going to retrieve it in a lighter industrial district situation than a heavy industrial district where they're now located. And the flex parks are a prime example of a location that would make sense. And in that instance, you may have some uses there where there's some storage that have potentially similar environmental issues, but those are taken care of by existing environmental regulation.
Are there any additional questions or comments from commissioners? Commissioner O'Haver?
I'm curious how high the bar is set for the Board of Adjustment. I mean, what are the findings that have to be made to receive approval?
This is Keegan McDonald. I can go through those with you. So typically there are 8 showings. The first just requires that it complies with all applicable provisions of the UDO. The second states that it's allowed as a special use. The third, that it complies with any use regulations specifically, and that no variance can be granted to those use standards. The fourth is that the proposed use is compatible with adjacent uses in terms of location, scale, site design, hours of operation, and operating characteristics. 5 is any adverse impacts resulting from the proposed use in the affected area will be effectively mitigated or offset, or the special use permit should be denied. 6 relates to appropriate access and vehicle circulation and mobility. The 7th is that signage is suitable and appropriate. And the 8th is that any dedication of streets and utilities to the public will be made prior to the issuance of the building permit. And of course, outside of these showings, the board again has the ability to impose conditions.
That's very helpful. Excellent. Thank you, Keegan.
Commissioner Miller?
For my own edification, on the special use permit, as part of obtaining the special use permit, do any neighbors have to be notified or provide consent?
Yes, so there's not a requirement that they provide consent. However, all property owners and tenants within 100 feet of the subject property do receive mail notice. There's also notice that has to be published on the subject property and on any multi-tenant properties if those addresses aren't available. So anyone with legal standing has an ability to submit evidence during the case and make their voice heard. I will say Board of Adjustment operates quasi-judicially, so it's different than a legislative process. Any evidence submitted has to be towards the showings that are specific to the special use permit. Conjecture or hearsay is not permitted as evidence. And so it is sort of a very narrowly tailored view. However, those specific showings have to be proven by the applicant and or disproven by any particular party with standing.
Commissioner Miller?
In that case, I'd like to move to approve TC 1521 and adopt the proposed consistency statement dated November 23rd, 2021, contained in the agenda materials.
Commissioner Rains?
Second.
Okay. Would we like to include in that motion the edit as proposed by Commissioner Rains previously to section C.2E?
Yes, I would like to propose a friendly amendment to my motion to make the amendment to the text change that you just cited.
Excellent, thank you. So we have a motion on the table from Commissioner Miller and a second by Commissioner Rains. That's for approval of TC 1521 with the proposed amendment to section C.2E. Is there any other discussion or debate on the merits of the motion? Commissioner Lampman?
I just ask one more question. It was a fast motion. We just had one more question about that environmental feature. I understand that what was discussed was that there are other regulating factors for environmental protections. Are we able to add in the use standards anything that would talk about an environmental review? I think that might be helpful if we're looking at, setting precedent, but it also allows for additional screening because a lot of these industrial uses, that is the main impact, is the environmental component. Are we able to add anything to the use standards that states that an environmental review or environmental considerations would be included? I don't know if that's overreaching from a text change component if it's regulated by other means.
Would staff like to answer that?
Yes, I can attempt to answer. I think there are certain use standards that state all state and local requirements must be met, or some generic phrase such as that. I will say it's difficult during administration, given the review that's occurring within the city, to ensure that all of those requirements are indeed up to par. There could be a process created to accept paperwork, but typically we lack the expertise to kind of verify those documents, and those types of issues would be sorted through a more of a complaint driven process, and such that it would require someone noticing, for instance, an environmental issue to then raise that particular concern, and often that would just be handled through the regulating agency or entity anyways.
I would just emphasize that I do feel that a towing yard would have considerable environmental impact. These cars are pretty mangled and there's a lot of fluid that comes out of these cars. I'm fully supportive of bringing this into the city because I do think that proximity is really, really important. But I do also think that this environmental consideration is also important. I don't know if there's any way to add it to a use standard or not.
Yeah, we could certainly explore that. I think we would maybe need some more specific language. I would say that none of the other heavy industrial uses have such language, and include things such as batching plants and other types of potentially noxious or environmentally hazardous uses. And we do feel that BOA requirement that any adverse impacts be mitigated is sort of that protection. And I'll just defer to anyone else on the call if they have any other comments on this particular matter.
It looked like Mr. York had his hand up.
Sometimes adding a use standard like that causes a couple of issues. One, it gets the city in the position of trying to enforce what the state should be enforcing. And that's a rabbit hole I don't think the city wants to jump down. The other is sometimes you're not eligible to receive your state approval until you've proven you've got local authority to develop at a certain location. I'm not sure if that's the case in this particular use, but I do know there have been times where it's a chicken or egg type of deal where the state often likes to wait until you've got an approved site plan or something along those lines before they process or issue an approval. If that's the case here, I don't know, but those are some of the reasons why if we have a finding, it's limited and general, as in the terms that that Keegan alluded to, and then that's more an enforcement issue. Once a violation of a state law has come to light.
Thank you for that, Mr. York. Commissioner Bennett?
I think this discussion is very helpful to me, but it just underscores for me why I think these should be pursued as individual rezonings and not a text change that just makes a blanket approval for these to be located all over the city, closer to residential areas. So that's where I am on this.
Excellent. So procedurally, we have a motion and a second on the table. I'm going to ask that we proceed with that vote. If that motion fails, we'll continue our discussion. I'll ask Chinitha for a roll call of members, and at the end of the vote, I will announce the outcome.
Commissioner Bennett, how do you vote?
Nay.
Commissioner Dartell?
Aye.
Commissioner Elder?
Aye.
Chair Fox?
Aye.
Commissioner Godinez?
Nay.
Commissioner Lampman?
Nay.
Vice Chairman?
Aye.
Commissioner Miller?
Aye.
Commissioner O'Haver?
Nay.
Commissioner Raines?
Aye.
The motion passes 6-4. All right, moving on to item D.2, which is TC 1721 for play structures. This is a request to amend Part 10 of the Unified Development Ordinance to modify the definition of accessory structure to exclude certain minor structures such as playhouses, swing sets, and basketball goals, exempting them from regulations such as setback. This item has not been previously discussed, so we'll start with a staff presentation from Justin Rometta.
Thank you, Chair Fox, and good morning, Planning Commissioners. If we could go to the next slide, please. So this text change is step one of what will be a two-step process that City Council authorized back in September of this year. At that time, they were acting on a report that they had received and requested from staff on simplifying and deregulating certain ancillary structures like backyard swing sets and play sets. Step two of that process is a broader overhaul of the accessory structure regulations, which we hope to bring you over the coming months. But this text change is really what you see as number one there on the screen, is that an amendment to the definition of accessory structure. So the UDO categorizes most buildings and structures on any given lot into two categories: it's principal and accessory. So the principal building is the primary structure on the lot that contain the main activity. So for example, the house on your single family home lot. Detached structures are those, they serve an ancillary purpose. They're smaller. We can go to the next slide, please. Some examples you see on the screen, anything from detached garages and sheds, carports, gazebos, and things like playground equipment and other structures that meet the definition on the next slide. So you can see the definition on the screen here. It is a broad definition, so this really encompasses any structure that's taller than 4 feet in height, really is subject to the accessory structure regulations. If we go to the next slide, I will briefly go over those. So the UDO has provisions for size in the form of gross floor area and also lot coverage in terms of footprint on a sliding scale based on lot size. You'll see that in the top table there, D1. You see on D2 on the bottom right, there are also regulations for overall height, wall height, and setbacks as well. And just as an example, I'd point your attention to that second to last row on the bottom table, D2 there. And you'll note that the closest closest an accessory structure can be to any side or rear property line is 10 feet. And that would increase based on height of the building up to 15 feet for a 1.5-story structure or 20 feet for a 2-story structure. Next slide. Some other accessory structure provisions. Primary structures are afforded certain encroachments into height and setbacks. So things like chimneys, solar panels can exceed height limits on principal buildings. Building features such as eaves, attached decks, bay windows are afforded allowances to extend into setbacks for principal structures. In addition, if a property owner feels they have some unique circumstance on their property that's causing a hardship, they have the option to seek relief from the Board of Adjustment from a variance to any of these rules. Neither of these provisions are currently afforded to accessory structures under the current code. Next slide, please. So this slide shows an amended definition of accessory structure, and the sentence you see in bold and underlined is the entirety of this text change. It is one sentence to amend the definition of accessory structure. And what it intends to do is exempt certain these minor recreational equipment structures associated with 1 or 2 unit living, such as playhouses, swing sets, and basketball goals. And so the impacts would be that these structures would be entirely deregulated. They would not have to meet any setbacks, nor would they be subject to any permitting requirements. That's it. This is a one-sentence text change. I am happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Romero. I believe there's one member of the public signed up to speak on this item. Can we call the speaker?
Jackie Charnes.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this discussion. I sent you all a letter last week that I'm hoping you all had a chance to read, that gave a little background into this situation and provided my opinions on this particular issue with the play sets. Let me repeat that I am not against play sets for children of any age or ability. My neighbor's child, who is also my godchild, has been diagnosed with autism. I personally have a degree in education, and in addition to teaching in public schools, I worked for 5 years at a school for mentally challenged and autistic children in Ohio. While I'm aware that some children have special needs, the issue of play sets that we're discussing today has no relation to a child's mental abilities or requirements. My goddaughter is an extremely well-mannered, high-functioning, pleasant young girl who can communicate very well with others. Having said this, her mental abilities have nothing to do with this issue. I guess my problem is regarding overbuilding these accessory structures on a property. They should be monitored for size dimensions, property line setbacks, and privacy. They need to be aesthetically pleasing to adjoining properties, because most large or tall play structures are placed in backyard areas that have an abundance of trees which provide privacy. And the current proposal for this TC 1721 that you've currently written doesn't provide a solution for any of these issues. It's just saying you can do what you want in your backyard. You can build it as big as you want. There's no setback. You can place it wherever you want. And I noticed on page 6 of the certified recommendation, there's a paragraph that you've entitled Alternatives Considered. And it states that it's difficult to code for every possible scenario in drafting a more relaxed set of regulations specific to the structures involved in this text change. And it's obviously sort of a conundrum that the Planning Commission has been placed in, because one person has decided to skirt the current rules and regulations currently in place with either a homeowners association or with the city of Raleigh. So if there isn't specific enhanced language placed into this text change, then there's no way to implement a way to solve the privacy issues, the water runoff issues, the aesthetics of a property. So in that case, maybe no changes need to be made, and everyone should continue to follow the code as currently written. My fear is that there is stormwater runoff from all the impervious structures in this scenario that's been presented that cover a large amount of my neighbor's backyard. It doesn't allow for the permeability of the soil to allow the runoff to go anywhere but to other adjoining properties, mine included. So I guess I'm concerned and I have an issue and a problem with how the text change has been written. Thank you for your time. I'd like to reserve the remaining time, if I have any, for further comment later.
Thank you, Ms. Sharns. Are there any other members of the public signed up to speak today?
That's all I had.
Okay, so I'd like to now allow for questions and comments from commissioners. Do any members have any questions or comments? Commissioner Miller?
Elsewhere in the UDO, does UDO provide definitions of playhouses, swing sets?
No, ma'am, it does not.
Based on that, I think maybe we could start to address some of I think we could reach the intent of this text change while also maybe addressing some concerns about sort of scope overreach if we provided a definition of playhouses and swing sets that fell under this provision.
Commissioner Lampman?
Do we have any history on any complaints of over elaborate play structures in people's backyards? Are there any other possible texts that could limit over elaborate play structures?
So as far as a history is concerned, the only one that I'm aware of was the kind of the impetus for this text change that was initiated by City Council. Certainly, there is other text that could be added. You could add, height, area, dimensional requirements. You can certainly add those things. In drafting the text change, I think it was, staffs took the approach of it was something that you know it when you see it, and so that the definition was clear enough. But certainly, if the commission wishes to add some further definitions or limits on these things, we can certainly do that.
I think.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Thank you. I think sometimes if something like this is specifically called out, it opens up a loophole that might not have been thought of before. Maybe there might be now areas where people could say, oh, but this is recreational, this is a play yard. So I have a little bit of concern about what we're opening up in terms of loophole incentives by including this. That's only a thought.
Commissioner Bennett and then Commissioner Dattell.
So this text change is to remove play sets, tree houses, etc., from regulation completely.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean if someone were to build a tree house or put up a play set, there's nobody that's going to come out and say, this is safe, this was built correctly? they just build it and they're done? Or, I mean, does that happen now? Does someone from the city come out when one of these is put up and inspect it and say this is safe? Or does that not happen anyway?
So if someone puts up a structure and obviously does not seek approval or permitting from the city has no way of knowing about that until someone complains about it. If a complaint were received, the city would conduct an investigation. And if it were found to be something that does require some approval or permit, then obviously some enforcement action would be taken, and the structure would either need to be inspected and meet code or removed.
So with the current process, is the person supposed to seek approval before putting one up? I guess that's my question. Is there some permit that is supposed to be sought and approved for putting these up now? I guess I'm just confused as to what we're doing, quite honestly. I mean, I feel a little bit like Judge Judy, and we're trying to arbitrate something going on between neighbors. So I'm trying to understand what we're doing and why. Are we trying to say that people would no longer have to do something that they currently have to do?
Yes.
I just
yes,
want
ma'am.
these to be safe. So if there's some sort of process that people have to go through now to ensure that what they're putting up for kids is safe, then I don't want to remove these from that process and have kids getting hurt because something is put up that's not safe. I understand that people may be doing it and not getting the proper, going through the proper process. But if there's a process that they're supposed to go through, I don't want for us to remove that process simply because neighbors are feuding.
So Commissioner Bennett, yeah, that's good questions. I would say that the regulations that I went over briefly in the presentation are the only ones that apply. And so if something rises to the level or meets that definition, essentially they're supposed to come in and get a zoning permit for that structure. Most of them do not rise to the level of anything that requires a building permit. So the zoning regulations are really there, as you saw, their height, their setbacks, their aesthetic standards. And they're meant to minimize impacts that structures might have on adjacent properties, but they don't have anything to do with safety. So the building code is really what regulates and enforces life safety issues. And those structures were large enough to warrant a building permit, then those requirements would kick in, but most of these do not.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And I think this sounds like a homeowner association issue and not a planning commission one. That's my thought.
Thank you, Commissioner Bennett. Commissioner Dautel, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, and it kind of maybe relates to some stuff that's already been said. I do agree that the fact that there is no definition of a playhouse is a problem. And then also, I just feel like removing that entire category completely seems like a mistake. If there's a specific part of the UDO that is causing a problem, like maybe the setback should be different than what they're listed as now, I think that's something that could be addressed. But it seems like just allowing any size, any location, anywhere, any height playhouse could be a recipe for disaster, and it seems unnecessary.
I'm going to offer an alternative perspective before I call on the last two. I think the majority of play structures are often purchased as kits, and I don't think most people get permits for a kitted slide or swing set. But we might be able to handle this in terms of the definition, at which point you are pouring foundations or doing on-site construction. Perhaps that's different than when you purchase a kit. I saw a hand up from, I believe, Commissioner O'Haver and Commissioner Rains.
Thanks, Chair Fox. Yeah, I just echo a lot of the comments already made. especially if, well, however we deal with it, whether it be through definition or beefing up the text change. But I think eliminating even any kind of square footage requirement just seems, at what point does it become a playhouse or not a playhouse? I mean, that seems odd. And then the setbacks, I mean, whether it's a kit or whether it's something that somebody builds and attaches to a 1.5 story structure, like in the picture that's shown on the bottom right of the staff presentation, what I'm hearing you say is that you could put a deluxe swing set kit right on somebody's property line, and it's just kind of there in their right at the edge of their yard. Seems a little like, not that I have anything with kids playing, but it just seems a little peculiar that that would be allowed, whether it be a kit or, again, that 1.5 story structure with a plastic slide attached to it, to be able to be built right on somebody's property line. So I think I definitely agree that play equipment needs to be pulled out of accessory structure requirements. But it seems like, in understanding staff's comment that Ms. Charnes pointed out about trying to regulate everything, there's sort of a tough spot to find where that is. But I feel like there needs to be a little bit more tightening up on whether it be a definition or some of the requirements.
Commissioner Miller?
Thank you. I specifically looking at the requirements for accessory structures, I'm comfortable with removing the permitting process generally, but having other UDO requirements in place, I think makes sense. Maybe not necessarily the setbacks, but it looks like we would also be removing the requirements that that they may not be taller than the principal building. So this could be taller than the principal building. That they could be located closer to the street than the principal building. Some of those other requirements for accessory structures, I would be in favor of keeping, even if we don't keep the setbacks, about vertical encroachments and that kind of thing as well.
Thank you. It sounds like a lot of the commissioners might have some concerns with this current text change in its form. We might want to add a definition of play equipment and address some of the setbacks. So without objection, I'm going to recommend that we hold this item till our next meeting, which is December 14th. Okay, seeing none. I'm going to move on to case number Z4121. This is a request to rezone approximately 1.69 acres near the intersection of South Bloodworth and East Cabarrus Streets from downtown mixed-use 3 stories detached with historic overlay district general to downtown mixed-use 3 stories urban general. The HOD, the Prince Hall Historic Overlay District, is proposed to be removed from the 9 parcels in question. The rezoning request also includes conditions prohibiting certain uses otherwise allowed in the DX district. This item has not been previously discussed, so I'd like to start with a staff presentation from Ira Mabel.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair Fox. Ira Mabel of Planning and Development. This slide says RHDC has not discussed the case yet. That is true for this particular rezoning. I believe we'll discuss it. There was a bit of discussion that's required whenever an HOD is proposed to be changed. So they did hear a report from Historic Preservation staff describing the extent of the change and referred that to council, and that is in your backup material. Other than that, your deadline for this case is in January. We can go to the next slide. So this site is at the sort of southeasternmost corner of downtown, in the transition zone between downtown and the residential neighborhoods further to the east. A lot of that OX you see there is on Shaw University property. Next slide, please. And this is a little bit of an easier map to read of the existing Prince Hall HOD. So this is separate from any National Register district. This is a zoning overlay. So it gives RHDC special authority per the UDO and is before you today because it is zoning like every other zoning. Next slide, please. So this is a picture of the site. For some reference, there's Red Hat in the top left and the Transport Company Food Hall, sort of the top right there, and Chavis Way running north to south. And the nearest sort of tallish building is at Shaw University dormitory, I believe, directly to the south. Next slide shows some pictures. So the photo number 1 there is the existing daycare, who the owners of the daycare own most of the land here and have been discussing expanding their daycare. And quite a bit of the site is currently used as either parking or playground by them. And then that picture number 3 are some of the other existing buildings that at different points in their life were various things, residential, commercial, but also included in their request. Next slide, please. One condition, which is to prohibit some uses otherwise allowed in downtown or DX zoning. Next slide. This slide is a bit complicated because of what the existing detached frontage allows versus an urban general frontage. So detached does not allow every building type in the UDO. So I've tried to list that out there. So there is quite a bit of change in development entitlement, even though the base district is changing and there aren't really a lot of conditions. But the frontage swap does open up a lot more building types available. Next slide, please. I won't dwell too much on this. Is downtown the urban core, so pretty high transportation, and a DX, request, pretty high scoring on all the energy analysis work that we do. Next slide, please. Lots of transportation assets in the area. Next slide. Does not include any affordability requirements, but does allow, basically every development type that we permit. Next slide. And is a very oldly platted, in the original Christmas plan from the city, in a sort of rapidly growing, more expensive part of the city. Next slide. So the future land use map is Central Business District, which is downtown. So the DX3 request is consistent with that. Next slide. And all the urban form is also downtown and core transit. So the urban general frontage is consistent with that. Next slide. So consistent with basically what we say should go downtown, a lot of development downtown. And the scale, a DX3 is consistent with the South Park. I have not mentioned this is just within the bounds of the South. It's at the edge of the boundary of the South Park small area plan. Such there should be small scale mixed use. So consistent with that. Next slide. The inconsistent policies. So a bit of a split on the urban design here. The map says that urban general is fine, but there is a policy, UD 1.10, that says zoning frontages should be consistent when possible along a street, and basically every other district on that street has the detached. So it's consistent with urban form, but not with what all the other districts are. So a bit of a mixed bag on that one. That HP should probably be on the next slide, please, which is all the historic preservation policies that are inconsistent here for basically removing the current overlay. And then a couple of South Park policies that say there should be, residential development here that matches the character of the historic district. Next slide. So consistent with the future land use map and the urban form map overall, but the historic preservation policies and just the nature of removing an HOD that's already existing, that stack of inconsistent policies for me weighed up to inconsistent overall. Next slide, with the comprehensive plan. So no other issues for me. We have two more chances to discuss this should you wish. As I mentioned, your deadline is the end of January. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mabel. Next, I'd like to hear from the applicant team. The applicant and all of those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Thank you. Good morning. This is Matt Ball, Morningstar Law Group, here on behalf of the applicant, Beginning and Beyond Child Development Center. We have Ted Van Dyke with New City, who will do a presentation you see before you, and Rosalind Blair, who is one of the applicants, will speak after Ted. I just want to provide a brief comment to provide some context. As noted, this really is about the HOD. This is the Prince Hall Historic District, which was established about 9 years ago. If you read the special character essay, it talks about this being an African-American neighborhood since Reconstruction. And it notes that Shaw University contributed to the area's vitality following the Civil War, as the university made Raleigh a magnet for African-Americans to settle where they pleased. And it says most of the streets are predominantly residential, but also commercial and institutional buildings are present. The applicants in many ways embody the purpose of this district. They moved to Raleigh to go to Shaw University, and then they decided to build their child care center and the vision they had to serve kids in the community in this neighborhood more than 2 decades ago. They did have concerns when this HOD was put in place, went through a number of different permutations with properties coming in and out, and they were just concerned of the impact it might have on their ability to continue there. So today really is about their efforts to realize their vision and expand and provide further services to this community. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ted Van Dyke.
Sorry, Mac, who were you turning to?
Ted Van Dyke, if you could unmute him.
Yep.
Slides quickly.
Thanks, everybody. Good morning. Mac, I hope you'll still stick around and be my page turner here. Want to make a couple points, y'all, and I hope that our slides will bear out some of what Mac's already said. Mac, can you start your slideshow there?
Well, can somebody advance them as Ted?
Oh, is it? Okay, there you go. As Max said, Beginning and Beyond has been here for 20 years. Roz will tell you more about the program and what she has been doing in the community during that time. She long predates the historic district. Let's keep rolling. I think we've seen the aerial view. I do want to point out, though, the historic district's characterization is residential. If you look just at the block we're on, in addition to the Beginnings and Beyond Child Care Center, there is a historic building. It's a barbershop that's also owned by Roz. It's going to undertake renovations. The building on the southeast corner at the bottom of the screen is Shaw University's Child Development Center, which is quite large, as you can see, in footprint. Also been, I believe, predates the historic district, but is within it. And then on the north corner, there's a church. So we have 1, 2, 3, at least 4 different uses on this site other than residential, just on this block. And it will keep going on the slides. We've seen this. In fact, the building that Roz occupies is an early 20th century building. It's been used for a number of commercial uses, including a funeral home at one time, I believe. So this parcel has traditionally been a commercial use since early in the century. Let's keep rolling. Just for some more color, here is the Sanborn map from 1909. The green circle is our site. That has a completely different cluster of buildings in 1909 than it does today. Just sort of scattered hither and yon. But to the left, a block to the north, was a farmer's tobacco warehouse, which had a 12,000 square foot footprint. And you can see how close proximity those buildings were to the residential structure to the east. So we've tried to make the point that during the period of significance, and believe me, we spent at least 8 months engaging with the Raleigh Historic Districts Commission, trying to work with them to make this project work. Our contention all along was that this is a mixed-use district, not merely a residential district. Let's take a look at another slide. Here's the Negro School for the Deaf and Blind that was about actually on the opposite corner from our site, which is in green there, and we can take a look at that building. We did have a picture of that building. Next slide. That was about a 28,000 foot footprint within a block of the site we're discussing today. Keep on going. Here's the Prince Hall building, which we have modeled our proposal on very heavily. 3-story building, brick building, commercial on the ground floor, 2 floors of other uses above. You can also see that during this period, which is a early 20th century photo, the buildings were placed quite close to one another. There was no transitioning or what we think of today as sort of feathering of different uses and different scales. There's a single family house pretty much directly adjacent to the Prince Hall building and another one directly behind it. This is about a 50-foot tall building, and the 3-story zoning, which we're reverting to, would also be a 50-foot height limit. Okay. Here's our existing site. Again, we have the Shaw University Daycare Center to our south. You can see the size of that footprint. You can see that most of our site is existing parking. To the left, and Roz will talk about this, is a large playground that you saw on the first slide, and that is going to be preserved. We have no plans to do anything with that playground except to continue to use. Can we keep rolling? Here's the proposal that we have been presenting, bringing our building up to the curb line, consistent with the other commercial buildings in the district, putting our parking behind us for drop off of kids, limited parking. We feel like there'll be a lot of walking, and Roz also serves her kids with 3 buses because many of them don't have transportation to their to and from daycare in the mornings and afternoons. So we have limited parking, all tucked behind the building, and bringing the building up to the corner of the street. Next. Here's a massing model. Again, the maximum height would be 50 feet. We are planning to do a rooftop terrace and to pull the 3rd floor back so that the effective scale of the building will only be 2 stories from the street. The building in the back, the little piece that says 1L, is a double height portion of the building, and that is a gym. What Roz has found is that Chavis Heights, even though they've got a brand new gym, it's heavily programmed. There's very little time open for her kids to go and utilize that facility, so she'd like to have one of her own to serve the community. Let's keep rolling. This is just a massing model of what a 3-story building looks like on that corner yesterday and today. Is that it for us? Oh, here's just a couple more views. And I will point out that the reason that this just looks like a white box instead of a more complete design is our initial approach with the Historic Districts Commission was to just get approval for our massing, with the understanding we would come back to them for all our details, materials, windows, all the things that customarily they are very attuned to making sure the building is compatible. And as I say, through the course of 7-8 months of process, we were getting, we are not getting very far. And Roz's decision at that point was, this is costing a ton of money. It's taking a ton of time. I need to build a daycare. Let's take another direction. So that's why we're before you today. I think that's it for me.
Madam Chair, I think Rosalind Blair had just a few comments.
Okay, please go forward. I just want to remind you there's 1 minute and 15 seconds left in your 10 minutes.
and she may be having a little bit of a technical challenge, but Roz, can you hear us?
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Rosalind Blair Sanders, co-owner and founder of Beginning and Beyond with my husband. It is indeed a pleasure to be here today. We are excited because this is something that is needed in the area. Bobby and I both attended Shaw, and we know that there is a need in the area. Beginning and Beyond has had an opportunity to be here for 25 years. I have a degree in elementary education, and I was a kindergarten teacher and found out that our children weren't where they needed to be. So what we did was we were able to do needs assessments, and I went back and got my master's in curriculum instruction. And what that allowed us to do is to do a needs right there in the Southeast Raleigh area, and we know that this was needed. And what we did was we put a design together in a facility that wasn't quite adequate, but it served the purpose at the time. Southeast Raleigh area has changed, and through the revitalization of the area, we have seen the area grow 365 degrees. What I want to say is, for us to remain where we are, we have to build a state-of-the-art building for our families. And in doing this, this is going to be a life enrichment center that's needed. And with gentrification coming to the area, it is going to show us that we may be this historical area, but it's going to be in name alone. This is something that we are committed for life to do. We're not interested in selling the property. What we're looking to do is just deem it where we can afford to build a facility that would meet the needs of the community. So I wanted to just let you all know that, and just let you know that what this is going to be is a community enrichment program. And in closing, I just want to thank you for hearing us today, and just consider us for what we're trying to do, and that's to serve our community.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Moderator, I believe there are some members of the public signed up to speak on this case. Can we call the first speaker?
Yes, I have Will Marks.
Oh, hi. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the chance to share. I got familiar with the Child Development Center through doing research for an application for the Raleigh Neighborhood Recognition Award, which they were nominated for and received in 2019. Through that process, I became intimately aware of the good work that they do, and that they started in 1999 through kindergarten readiness, childhood developed life skills, achieving well-functioning life skills, which include cooking, nutrition training, etiquette, manners, recognizing stranger danger, and understanding personal boundaries. Learning at their own pace is a way to unlock the child understanding that there's a path to achieving their full potential, and providing providing help in a holistic way, so that children are able to develop intellectually, physically, emotionally, and socially. Roz Blair Sanders has become a close personal friend of mine over the years, and she is committed. She didn't even get into how she was commuting from Ohio to North Carolina to make this dream come true. She got her master's degree after getting her bachelor's at Shaw. She got her master's in curriculum and instruction at Cleveland State University. And she works by the African proverb, tomorrow belongs to the people who prepare for today. And that's what she and Bobby have dedicated their lives to. They've got informal models at the Child Development Center, which are where good beginnings last a lifetime and where children are learning for life. What this boils down to is this rezoning request is really about what is the return that the city is going to get. And the city's going to get...
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Marks. I just wanted to let you know you were at time.
Okay, I appreciate it. The city's just going to get an incalculable return on their investment to rezone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have Andy Gilbert.
Thank you. If the members of the group received my email that I sent in, really the main thing I want to add here is there's already precedent within the Prince Hall Historic District for the DX3UG. There's a very significant amount of property larger than what is being proposed. It's already that. The issue on the table, though, is the removal of this from the historic overlay. It just, as the group has said, they've been working with the RHDC, and I guess have not, been able to work with them. Many of us did. We've gone through this process. This is all about not wanting to follow the rules of that group. The size of this historic overlay is one of the smallest of the 8 in the city. Taking this much land out of it, I would submit to the group, table this particular request and disband and remove Prince Hall. It's that devastating. So the folks who live in here, we followed all of these rules. We're following them today. People do that. I know you mentioned Shaw University and their daycare. They basically just went and tore every tree out of it and ripped it apart and didn't submit a single application. Happened just literally last week. So we all support this project. When I say we all, the people I talk to that live here, we walk by that daycare every day. We support this. We back it. We want it to happen. We do not want it removed from the historic overlay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Last speaker is Jenny Harper.
Thank you.
Can you please mute me?
Good morning. My name is Jenny Harper. For the past 16 years, I've lived with my family at 312 East Cabarrus Street in Prince Hall. Our house turned 100 this year, and my family and I have been honored to be stewards of this historic cultural asset. We, along with many of my neighbors, some of whom are sadly no longer with us, were proud to both champion and witness the establishment of the Prince Hall Historic Overlay District in 2012. We are small. We are so small already, but we are so important, with so much history here that's critical to not forget. A small collection of building uses and types, residential, commercial, institutional, intertwined with one another. Over the years that we've lived here, things have changed an awful lot. While we have neighbors who lived in Prince Hall for decades upon decades, we've also seen long vacant houses rehabbed instead of demolished, long shuttered commercial buildings rehabbed and reopened, all brought to new life, some taking advantage of historic rehabilitation tax credits available. Unlike the area south and east of us, we haven't had any demolitions in the near decade that the HOD has been in place, which is a testament to its importance. New residents, new small business owners, we've also enjoyed new workforce housing constructed, modern infill townhouses, infill that's more traditional in design, endangered historic houses destined for the landfill have been relocated and restored here. The former Gethsemane Seventh-day Adventist Church, damaged in the 2011 tornado, within hours of being demolished, saved, restored, now a Raleigh historic landmark. Much of this is because this HOD has been in place as a tool, a bulwark, and a voice that this community would not have otherwise had. As I've expressed in other meetings about this case, we support the daycare 100%, and we are all enriched by it being here. I can't imagine anyone not wanting the daycare to not only remain here, but to continue thriving. But the HOD doesn't regulate use, and there's nothing about the HOD that prohibits continued enjoyment of use as a daycare. There is nothing in this rezoning application that stipulates it will remain in fact a daycare among the small handful of zoning conditions offered, which is a concern with an assemblage that has a collective tax value of over $4 million. Carving out 9 individual parcels along 3 blocks, more than half of which were acquired since the Prince Hall HOD took effect, with 5 contributing historic
Ms. Harper, I just wanted to let you know that your time has expired.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any additional speakers?
That's all I had.
Okay. I'd now like to allow for questions and comments from commissioners. I'll start off with a question of staff just to put this in context. Do we have any calculations on the acreage of this particular HOD as compared to the proposed acreage of the removed parcels?
Yeah, so the HOD, not counting Stronach's Alley, which is right away, is on the order of 22, 23 acres. And this request, I wrote in my staff report, is 1.7. So my quick math is that's 7.5%, give or take.
Thank you for that, Ira. Okay, do any commissioners have any questions or comments? Commissioner O'Haver?
Yeah, I have about 4 pages of notes, so I'll just start with just a couple. I understand, did I hear that the business was started in 1999? Was that what I heard?
I believe that's correct. Around that time.
Okay, and so looking at when the Prince Hall Historic District was adopted was in 2012. And so I'm curious about the property owner's position at that point. It's one thing to move into a historic district when you know it's a historic district, which I live in one. But I'm just curious sort of what the position was at the start of that. But I also noticed that it was already reduced in 2015. So there is precedent. This map does seem somewhat arbitrary. Thank you, Ira, for pronouncing that alleyway. Like, that's just curious that that alleyway is preserved to the west there, but none of those properties. Well, I guess it's not my last question. I guess it's a thought. Historic until when? I mean, the applicant clearly demonstrated that this has been a mixed use block, that there's been lots of changes over the years. So I guess my last question is, I think I heard the applicant's representative say that they've been working for 8 months with RHDC. So when the neighbor had commented that, you know, following the rules of the commission, I'm curious where the rub is to get to this point. 8 months is a long time, and we all know that time equals money. It certainly sounds like it's would be a great addition to the community. So I'm curious about what those issues are.
Are there any staff available from RHDC who can answer those questions?
Yes, Chair Fox, this is Erin Morton. Good morning, Commission. I am staff to the Raleigh Historic Development Commission and a part of the planning department with the city. Those were a lot of questions, so I'll cover those as best I can. If I miss anything, please let me know. The application itself was officially filed with the city on March 10th, 2021. Prior to that application submission, the applicant attended what's called the Design Review Advisory Committee, which is an informal group of former COA committee members, largely professional designers that are familiar with the COA process. They attended that meeting on February 1st prior to officially submitting, and that's a requirement for all COA applications for new construction. So that's where our official timeline begins on the COA application. It was heard by the COA committee for the first time on April 22nd, 2021, and deferred until the next meeting with some additional questions and comments from the committee members that they would like to see addressed. And if you would like, we can provide the decision letter that kind of outlines those suggestions. And the next meeting would have been May 27th. The applicant emailed to withdraw the application on May 18th. In terms of the boundaries of the Prince Hall Historic District, it was designated through ordinance, local city ordinance in 2012. Due to the rapidly changing nature of the area, this was a priority at the time for the city and the neighborhood to protect the historic resources of this area. I believe the Shaw Early Childhood Development Center was constructed in 2007, so that was prior to district designation, and we have not ever received a COA application from that property since its designation. What other questions did you have?
I believe you addressed a number of them, but just for one moment, You offered getting the committee comments from the COA committee meeting on April 22nd. I do believe that might be helpful in terms of review of this case.
We can certainly provide that decision letter that was provided to the applicants to you as well. I'll note that the general nature of a deferral is either because the application is incomplete or inconsistent, where the committee is not sure what they're being asked ultimately to approve, or there are certain revisions they would like to see to the application in order to bring it into congruity with the character of the historic district. The design guidelines document is the document by which the COA committee reviews all decisions. The special character essay for Prince Hall also informs what specifically has been identified to, create the historic character of that area. So that's a special piece that they pay attention to as well. In terms of the special character essay, it does note that there are commercial and residential structures throughout the district. They're largely, the larger massing of buildings are typically concentrated on the west side of the district along Blunt Street. Let's see, additional just COA process items. The RHDC's COA committee does not review use at all. So it's just the form of the buildings and how they are congruous with the rest of the district. Specifically, looking within 1.5 blocks is typically suggested. And then this is a smaller historic district. It's about 4 blocks approximately. So I believe that the committee was presented with several examples that you saw today that they were considering as a part of the decision, but they ultimately did not have the opportunity to render a final decision.
Thank you, that's helpful. Apologies, Commissioner O'Haver, I believe you had a follow-up question.
I was just, again, I was curious about, I just think it's interesting that the business was in place in 1999 and the owner was obviously there, the applicant was there during the time of the overlay district. And so I'm just curious, maybe either Mac or Ted or Ms. Blair can comment on that. I was curious about how it's defined. I mean, why is Stronk's Alley, I'm trying to get back to that graphic now, maybe I've mispronounced that, not included in it. And I guess Ms. Morton just mentioned something about congruency within a 1.5 block radius. Those modern townhomes, which I love, I have no issue with those at all, are certainly within that radius, or at least right on the edge of it, if it's not specifically. And so I'm just a little confused about what the issues are here.
Commissioner O'Haver, this is Erin Morton again. Would you like me to respond?
Ma'am, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. So yes, 1.5 blocks is typical for looking at what they're called nearby well-related buildings. I should have specified that that is in relation to historic buildings in the district, as well as resources that are listed as contributing to the historic district. Obviously, the townhouses located about 1 block away are new construction. They were approved through the COA process. And I believe were also presented as evidence during the single COA hearing. In terms of Stronach's Alley, there is a blurb addressing that in the Historic Overlay District Designation Report. A lot of these materials are attached in the agenda items on board docs, though admittedly it's a lot to dig through. The original study boundaries included a city block bounded by East Cabarrus, Wilmington, Lenoir, and Blunt Streets. And Stronach's Alley itself was recommended for designation due to its historical and cultural significance. The properties located within the block, while not included, are recognized in the report as archaeologically significant. And essentially it provides a window into the area's early multi-use district history. So that's a historic alleyway. There were residences, businesses, commercial life all along that alleyway. And a significant feature of the block is also the two-story Dr. Manassas Pope house, which is now a city museum, constructed in 1900 and a Raleigh historic landmark. So there are no other historic resources along the alley that remain standing, but the alleyway itself is a historic representation of the historic neighborhood.
Thank you. Is there any additional follow-up on that, Commissioner Weaver?
Like I said, I'll just sit back for a few minutes and listen to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you. Did I see another hand up from another commissioner? Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair Fox. This case has caused me a little consternation. I've struggled with it a little bit, actually a lot. And I've had to keep reminding myself of what staff has gently reminded me of on several occasions, that we're not here to vote on use. Because my initial gut reaction was, well, this is fantastic. It's serving the community that's there. It's helping to build a community. It's not catering to people coming from outside, which is something I've commented on before, particularly with these historic communities and historically Black communities. So it's doing all the things that I think it should do, but that's not what I'm asked to decide. I'm asked to decide if the parcel should be removed from the historic district. And that's also something that I've talked passionately about. I think we should do everything we can to preserve historically Black communities. I've made the comment before that it seems like a lot of the preservation that we do is simply to have pictures and monuments and artwork, but we don't actually have the community. Here's a situation where we have the community and we're asking to take 9 parcels out of it. I have zero problem with the daycare expanding. What I'm thinking about is long-term, when Ms. Blair might sell the property. I understand she's not looking to sell it now. What happens in the future when the daycare is, when she's no longer operating the daycare and she wants to sell it, and we have this fairly substantial chunk of land that is now not protected at all in this prime location in downtown Raleigh? What impact is that going to have on what remains of the historic district? So I have all of that kind of in my head as I'm trying to think about this and be fair and be consistent. I try to be consistent. I also don't want to, I'm also curious about why there have been the difficulties in working with RHDC, but I don't want to disrespect that commission at all. I respect their expertise and their judgment and the process that they have in place. And I don't think it is our role to question, their process. I do think sometimes historic districts or overlay districts in general can have the unintended consequence of adversely affecting small business owners, minority property owners. I don't think that's anything that's intentional, but it does happen sometimes unintentionally. So I've been trying to think through if there are any equity issues here with this small minority business owner not being able to, do what she's trying to do for the community and respect this process. However, ultimately, we're being asked to determine the consistency of pulling these parcels out of the historic district. And I just think the long-term consequences and the impact to the historic district are significant enough that it outweighs what I think is a fantastic use. I just don't think we're being asked to rule on the use. And I think pulling the parcels out of the historic district would be an adverse long-term use to it. So that's kind of how I'm working my way through this.
Thank you for your comments. Commissioner Lampman?
Thank you, Commissioner Bennett. That was perfect. I think that what the applicant should be hearing is that we really want to embrace this. I understand that resources are finite. I think that if I could offer, there might be opportunities for additional funding. I may actually encourage the American Recovery Act funds that we discussed last time in the Strategic Planning Committee. This might provide financial resources to support something of this nature, because I do think that the service that you provide is extraordinarily needed in this area. I overemphasize how much your services are needed. I think the pressure also, to Commissioner Bennett's point, to go back to the historic committee, I would encourage the historic committee to, and again, policies, I don't know exactly same lines that Nicole or Commissioner Bennett was speaking of. If there is a way to work with the applicant further on this, I do not feel comfortable overriding another committee and overriding another overarching, again, where we do have limited historic designations. But I think that there's a really positive outcome here. Again, I think I'm of the opinion to really support the applicant, but I cannot do it at the expense of our historic preservation. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I was wondering if I could get historic preservation to just clarify one point for me. You said this and I was avidly taking notes and I might have written it incorrectly. So the original application was filed at the beginning of March. There was a review at the DRAC. There was a COA committee meeting, and then there was no final decision on a COA. The application was just pulled in May. So that's March through May. Is that accurate?
Chair Fox, this is Erin again. Yes, that is accurate. And I will add that though the December 21st regular monthly business meeting of the RHDC has not yet been set, that will happen at our executive committee meeting on December 2nd. We anticipate that the rezoning case will be heard by the RHDC on December 21st.
Thank you for that. Commissioner O'Haver.
I want to clarify my point, since Commissioner Lampman and Commissioner Bennett mentioned it. I'm not suggesting we override the RHDC, and I'm certainly not suggesting that we overreach what we're asking to do. I'm just trying to figure out, again, I know the applicants, I know the type of work they do, I know their commitment to the community. I look forward to meeting Miss Blair. Sounds like she's a big part of the community, and so I'm just confused. I'm just trying to figure out, and maybe if the other commissioners would be open to it, maybe we can ask the applicant what their position is. I'm just trying to figure out, because of all of the things that Commissioner Lampman and Commissioner Bennett mentioned, and I'm certainly not trying to make a decision on use. It just seems that we adopted boundaries in 2012, and so I'm just asking historic to what? Because the applicant clearly demonstrated throughout history, even way before not even that far before 2012, that there were certain development patterns within this block. And so it seems arbitrary. I understand that Stronix Alley has some historic significance, but if you just look at how that boundary is laid out, regardless of whether or not there's standing structures on the remaining parcels, there's certainly vacant parcels within the boundary now. I'm not suggesting we get rid of historic boundaries. I'm just trying to understand what the issue is here when we build modern condos a block away that I love. And I'm just confused by that. So if my other commissioners are open, perhaps at least just to get a sense of where the applicant or what Ms. Blair thinks the issues are with RHTC, I would be happy to hear those. I don't know if I'm going down a rabbit hole or not, but.
Is the applicant available?
Yes. You want me to, I can speak to it, and then Ted certainly can address more of the RHDC, but we understand, it may not be fruitful to get into a lengthy, issues with the process, because, kind of we are where we are. I would simply say that the applicant, has filed this request, remove the HOD. We certainly are open to conditions that could address some of the concerns, like if it were ever developed for something other than a daycare, because that's certainly her intent. Massing or materials, things of that, or scale, things of that nature. But the HOD process for the applicant has had a significant imposition with cost and her ability to remain here. So she feels very strongly about that aspect of it. And I understand if commissioners feel really strongly about the HOD issue and needing to stay, and if you're not open to conditions, I'd say let's move on with the process. If there's some things that you want to suggest or put on the table relative to conditions, we certainly would be open to that.
Commissioner Miller?
Thank you. I think Commissioner Bennett explained some of the issues we're weighing quite succinctly, so I don't need to repeat those. I will say just to echo a lot of what other folks are saying, certainly I am very supportive of expanding this use to support the local community. However, this rezoning application on its face is just to rezone this area to DX3, urban to downtown mixed use, urban general. And the only condition is to condition out a couple of uses, like cemeteries and adult establishments and that kind of thing. And so this, on its face, I think doesn't go far enough to protect what the goal is here. So I would be interested in perhaps deferring this case and letting the applicant consider whether conditions might be more appropriate, or going back, or if the right conditions, because we can't condition use in, is not appropriate, if going back to RHDC would be the more appropriate way forward.
Thank you. I have a question for staff just on timing. It sounds like the rezoning is going to be heard at RHDC at their December 21 meeting. Do we still have enough time if we wait until after that RHDC meeting?
This is Ira again. You can. Your deadline is the end of January. I believe there's one January meeting. If you care to know what they say, I would say if you're ready to make a motion today, City Council cannot hear this case until January, so it is more than likely that they will also receive RHDC's report, presuming RHDC does their business in one meeting. So I think the chances are pretty high that City Council would have both your recommendation and the Historic Development Commission's recommendation when they make their decision. But you do have time to wait on them should you choose.
Thank you. I'd be interested in waiting to hear what happens at that RHDC meeting, and then also getting the COA committee report from the pulled application. Commissioner Lampman?
I am operating under an assumption that these meetings are recorded. I was wondering if links to the recording could be provided in the application material or in the staff presentation. And in terms of timing, I know sometimes there's a lag in terms of publishing it on YouTube. If we could just get access to the meeting as part of our meeting support materials, I think that would be helpful too. At least we can hear some of the context straight from those discussions as to where there might be some challenges in the application process. Again, I don't want to override the historic district, but I think that there might be an opportunity to see where we can help in this.
Ms. Lampman, this is Ted Van Dyke. I appreciate that. And just to give you a couple clues, because we've been sort of dancing around the issue a bit, we started our conversations with RHDC well before last March. Obviously, we had to do a design, we had to do research, we had to program the building, we met with staff, we had 2 meetings with the advisory group. When we got to the formal committee, there were comments ranging, and by the way, it was working with staff that we decided only to ask for massing. There was a similar project on Glenwood South that initially asked only for a massing approval and then a second approval for details. So we thought that was a good blueprint here so that the applicant would have confidence that as we kept spending money and kept designing, we were getting somewhere. When we got to the full commission, there was, and I hope you will review the records, there was comments ranging from, well, I just think you need to pull that balcony back another 10 feet to, you need to break this building up into multiple smaller buildings and put them on the individual parcels, because that's the pattern that was extant, 100 years ago. Of course, the building that Roz is in now doesn't follow that pattern. It's a 2-story commercial building. So we got a variety of inputs. There was no consensus on a way forward. And I am not trying to criticize the process, but only to say that if you're doing a small residential project and you're trying to get a patio or a fence or something approved, the 5 to 10 days you have to make revisions to your application to be heard the next month is reasonable. For a 30,000-foot building, when the feedback, it ranges from pull your balcony back to break it up into 5 pieces, and we have no opportunity to have any conversation with the RHDC. They are quasi-judicial. There is no, what did you mean by that? What do you think of this? How about if we try this? Here's some things we plan to do. Our only course of action is to appear 2 months later with another design and take our chances that we've somehow gotten closer to something that's approvable than we had 2 months previous. So it's not as simple as we just didn't want to follow the rules on a project that's a 30,000-foot, 3-story commercial building. The way that the RHDC is structured is really for residential projects. I live in a historic district. 110-year-old houses. The last thing I'm trying to do is disparage the character and quality and value of our historic fabric in this city. That is the last thing we want to do. That's why we did our best to engage with RHDC. We just, at the end of that first hearing, felt that we were so lost and had so little guidance on what a pathway to approval was that Roz felt like she wanted to take an alternate pathway and really wanted to build this building. That's where we are today. So I just hope that offers a little color. I do invite you all to read the report and make sure that I'm offering an accurate appraisal there.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Van Dyke. While we have you on the line, can you speak specifically to how your massing meets the current existing zoning with the detached frontage requirement?
The detached frontage requirement, I think the only elements of the detached frontage that I understand are that it prohibits parking in front of the building and requires the parking to be in back. I may be wrong. There may be other provisions of DE. I think the other problem with DE is, unlike the urban frontages, it doesn't give us the parking reductions that are enjoyed in the rest of the downtown. DE does not have the parking reductions, and candidly, we have not explored whether the being in the downtown overlay gives us that reduction or whether it doesn't. DE does not, by right. It's not an urban frontage.
I believe parking requirements have been removed for the DX district, just as an FYI. So it does sound like commissioners need a little bit additional information. I'd also like to hold this case until our January meeting to be able to get some final information from RHDC. That also provides the applicant some time to provide additional conditions should they choose. and those conditions might address some of the character essay components of the Prince Hall Historic Overlay District. Okay, without objection, we're going to move on to the next case. Case number D.4, this is Z5221. This is a request to rezone approximately 0.7 acres along West Morgan Street from downtown mixed-use 12-story shopfront to downtown mixed-use 40-story shopfront conditions. Proposed zoning conditions prohibit certain uses, require parking deck screening to meet certain minimum design standards, and required parking deck lights to not be visible from adjacent right-of-way or parcels. This item's not been previously discussed, so we will start with a staff presentation from Ira Mabel.
Good morning again. Your deadline, like every other new business case, is in January. You can go right to the next slide. So this case is, surround in the sea of maroon is the DX, varying in heights from 12, mostly in 20, to a couple of 40 stories, which I'll point out on the next slide here. So this is ringing a bell. There were two other cases, basically down Harrington Street, Z5420 and Z1421, also for DX40, basically also mimicking, or the same set of parking deck screening conditions apply. But this site is directly adjacent to the Dawson, where I believe that we have quite a number of speakers today. So this shown there. And then the Hugh building is that sort of backwards C-shaped or D-shaped building on the southeastern corner of the block, excuse me. Next slide. Three conditions on the site. If you can go back one, JP. The first, prohibiting some uses, and then two, which you've seen, as I mentioned a couple of times before, about parking deck screening and internal light sources. These were draft conditions developed by the Urban Design Center in response to a council request to strengthen our design standards on parking decks. That's somewhere in the text change process. I can't speak specifically where it is, but we'll probably be in a text change committee meeting near you soon. There was a third condition recommended about the 42-inch, I want to say, parapet wall, also that neither of the other two zoning cases nor this one has included. But my understanding is still part of what the Urban Design Center is recommending. Now we can go to the next slide, which shows a couple of street views of the case. Or this one, which is fine, which is the change in entitlement. So basically just from 12 to 40, that multiplier applied to everything. Next slide. Same story about zoning downtown and transportation and energy. I'll say this is very close to the Rust Bus site, so 2 blocks or so walking distance from where that transit center will be. Next slide. Same answers for the affordability analysis, although another interesting point of frontages here is that shopfront would not allow detached or townhouses, should that matter to anybody. But next slide, please. And then the same, basically same couple of bullet points about the history, land use history, and demographics as the last case. Next slide.
Well, I've got this case coming up right now. The one
I believe we have one of the speakers are unmuted right now.
I think that's Mac.
Mac, if we could get you to mute your mic. Okay.
Thanks, Ray. The request is consistent with the Central Business District, which recommends DX, and does not have any specific. There's no specific policy recommendations in the comprehensive plan that says 40 stories is inappropriate at this particular location. There are policies in the downtown chapter of the comp plan and elsewhere that sometimes say that, but not in this case, especially with how close it is to Rust Bus and Raleigh Union Station. Next slide, consistent with urban form, so the shopfront frontage does comply with downtown and core transit designations. Next slide, please. So consistent with the comp plan overall and the future land use and urban form maps. Next slide. Consistent policies having to do with development downtown, development close to transit, urban design, and so on. I think the next slide is more of the same. The site is within the Downtown West Gateway small area plan. It is in the station area core section of that plan, which recommends high density and a lot of height to support the transit stations on this side of town. Next slide. The two inconsistent policies, and this is similar with the other cases, really are just the existing development. So the site is close to existing development that is not nearly as tall as even what the current zoning would allow. And also in this particular case, Parks and Recreation staff flagged or provided a bit more context of their downtown amenity studies, various studies, and recommendations for those, suggesting that some additional public realm amenities would be particularly useful at this location. But really, the compatibility is the issue for this request. Next slide, please. And again, your deadline is in January with a couple of meetings at your disposal. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mabel. Next, I'd like to hear from the applicant team. The applicant and those in support have a total of 10 minutes to speak.
Good morning, Mac Paul, Morningstar Law Group, 421 Fayetteville Street, here on behalf of the applicant, Wilmer Wright. In a moment, Eric Wright from Wilmer Wright will say a few words, introduce himself. I'd just give some background on the case. As you heard from the staff report, essentially following the comprehensive plan for this particular site, knowing early on that whatever is built here is going to change dramatically the views on the west side of the Dawson. We reached out before we filed anything and have had a number of meetings, and appreciate the generosity and we've visited residents on that side of the building and have had a number of conversations. More recently, some very specific comments and recommendations from some of the residents. We have worked to follow the best practices, and so like the screening of the parking decks were conditions we had gathered from staff. If there's some additional technical changes relative to the parapet wall or any other recommendations coming with staff relative to best practices with the parking, we certainly would like to follow that. Most of the other areas that we've discussed either are design in nature. We've offered, and I think there's interest in sitting down with the Urban Design Center as we go through the design process to consider some of the building design issues, but those are really, relative to the building permit, post zoning. And I think the Dawson folks have had good experience working with the developers across the street with 301 Hillsborough as that building was constructed. We do have the benefit of Barrett Dixon here on the call with us with Jay Davis, which is a local architecture firm that did Smoky Hollow and the Dillon and One Glenwood. So very familiar with the area and has been working on massing studies to help inform some of those conversations. Again, more of the building design in nature. So the main concern we have of going beyond sort of the best practices offered by the comprehensive plan and the UDO are just not wanting to be too prescriptive in terms of a building that hasn't been designed yet. So that's sort of been the sticking point as far as additional conditions at this point. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Eric Wright just to say a word about
Wilmerite and kind of what their vision is for this site.
Yeah, thanks, Mac, and thank you all for the time today. My name's Eric Wright. I'm the Vice President of Construction at Wilmerite. Just a little bit about Wilmerite. We're a third-generation family company headquartered in Rochester, New York. We've got more than 80 years experience in real estate development and construction management. We've developed in every major real estate class, with retail being the primary focus in the 80s and 90s. The company successfully completed 8 super regional shopping centers in the eastern United States, including Tyson's Corner Center in Virginia. In 2006, we sold our shopping center portfolio and diversified our development strategy. Since then, we've developed and operated over 1.5 billion of new projects. We most recently completed a student housing development adjacent to Duke University in Durham, and we're excited to continue our growth in the Triangle region. Well, as Max said, we haven't started the design on our project yet. We're focused on high-end multifamily, and we feel that the upzoning of this site is consistent with the city's comprehensive plan. We understand there's been some hesitation from the adjacent property owners due to the size of the project, and we've been actively trying to understand their concerns. At this time, we aren't ready to add additional conditions to our zoning that could hinder the development of the project, but we are committed to working with the neighborhood and city to follow urban design standards and make sure this project is an asset to the community as a whole.
Do we have any additional members wishing to speak in support of the project? With that,
I wasn't sure if Barrett had anything to add to the conversation before we move on to opposition.
thank you.
No, nothing for me to add.
So we're going to move on. I believe we have a number of members of the public signed up to speak in opposition. Those in opposition have a total of 10 minutes to speak. I ask you all to be mindful. I will remind you that we do read all of your emails, and I believe one of the speakers who signed up provided a video and a presentation, which we're all very familiar with at this point. So if we could please call the first speaker.
The first speaker that we have is Wendy Oppenheimer, and she's asked to speak also for Ashish and Chloe Braganza.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, ma'am.
Wonderful. And procedurally, before the time clock starts, I just want to confirm that I'll have 3 minutes available to speak, since I'm speaking on behalf of myself, my husband and my daughter. My husband and daughter were here for the last 2.5 hours, but had to leave for an appointment. So I'll be reclaiming their time.
Please proceed.
Okay, thank you so much. So for context, my family and I have lived at the Dawson for nearly a decade, and we're supportive of the rezoning and growth in downtown Raleigh when done properly. That's the key caveat: when done properly. We know the Planning Commission wants to make thoughtful decisions that consider the context and impact of DX40 rezonings on the neighbors, and not approve all DX40 applications due to pressures either from developers, politicians, or more broadly, the desire to improve deemed underutilized properties at all costs to the neighborhood. This DX40 case is unique since the rezoning property is located within 6 feet of an established residential building that has 66 homes, 40 windows, and 10 balconies facing the rezoning. And none of the other DX40 cases in the warehouse district that have been approved were within 6 feet of a residential building. All had major buffers, like a parking deck or a surface parking lot between them. And I think Ira had referenced and shown images of some of those prior rezoning cases. And my neighbor, Dan McQuaid, will be presenting some of that information in more detail. So as not to be redundant, I'm going to gloss over that. And because of the direct proximity, the negative impacts to our quality of life and value of our properties will be exponentially worse than in the prior DX40 rezoning. Next slide, please. So the Dawson is a vertical neighborhood. And when you think about rezonings, you have to kind of expand your mind, especially as you're increasing the density in the warehouse district, that neighborhoods are not exclusively single family home sprawling communities. I had an opportunity to meet with Councilmember Fort earlier this month to discuss this case, and she and I both agreed that City Council should never approve a skyscraper being built within 6 feet of an established residential neighborhood / building. So as you think about urban design, buildings can be neighborhoods, and it's discriminatory to think of neighborhoods, existing residential neighborhoods, as only being horizontal layouts. They can be, in fact, vertical buildings that are neighborhoods. And so as you think about this, we ask that you consider the Dawson to be a residential neighborhood. And would you ever consider putting a potentially 40-story building directly adjacent within 6 feet of an existing residential neighborhood? And I would also further submit that the density beside our building, with the 301 Hillsborough construction, the Pendo building, the other DX40s that have been approved thus far, which I would argue were a mistake and should not have been approved, the DX12 zoning that's currently approved for the property is more than sufficient to improve the property value of what's currently underutilized by the two-story buildings that have occupied the property for a long time. A DX40 in this case is overwhelming and unnecessary. And so I'd like to, in the interest of time, skip over my next 2 slides, or at least the next slide. Could we please advance? And we'll stay here for a moment. This is just a street view of the rezoning property and our property. There's a small alleyway that separates them. And in talking with the developer, my understanding is that they intend to build to the property line, which you can see is that curb line just before the meters that are on our side. So there's currently a 2-story building, and then our building is 5 stories. And it in no way is a natural transition to go from 5 stories to 40 stories with no kind of buffer. And as I said, they intend to develop right up to the property line. It's going to have massive impacts to our quality of life and to our property values. Next slide, please.
Apologize.
So,
I believe we're at time. I wasn't able to see the clock at first. I'll let you finish your sentence. Just go right ahead.
I'm trying to check for the time clock. I thought that I set my own timer. I believe I had 3 minutes and it's expired. Well, in that case, I will say very quickly then that we have met the neighborhood, the residents of the Dawson. We have met with in the two public meetings with Wilmerite and their council. And in both of those meetings, it's been enormously frustrating. They have dismissed all of our questions and concerns with total condescension and indifference, so much so that my family individually scheduled a meeting, which Mac just referenced in his prior comments, where we asked them specifically to consider 20+ reasonable conditions to provide more protections to our building, because most concerningly in their application, there are no specific design details about where the building is going to be located or what the building is going to look like. And it's enormously concerning that a New York developer who specializes in shopping malls, casinos, and student housing, that has no experience in downtown Raleigh, that has never built a building larger than 12 stories, can come in and destroy a family neighborhood, basically, that's vertical, and that to be allowed. And so we requested that they at least consider very reasonable conditions, 20 of them, and they were summarily rejected halfway through our meeting with them last Friday. This process is entirely unacceptable. We know that the Planning Commission wants to make good choices that respect the neighborhood and allow the property to be developed into a better state. But DX40 is entirely unacceptable given the flat out rejection of all of the reasonable conditions that we put forward that are enumerated in the slides that follow, which I've run out of time to present in more detail, but I understand you have read prior to this meeting. So our request is that the Planning Commission not approve this application because of the outright insult and the process has been so inappropriate. We've attended these public meetings. They've been
Thank you for
basically a
your
waste of time.
comments. I believe we've gone over time. You're cutting into the time of other speakers at this point.
Okay, and then lastly, because not everyone has the time to spend 2.5 hours or 3 waiting in a meeting to talk for 3 minutes on an issue, we sent a petition to our building residents. Over 50% of them are in opposition.
Thank you. If we could call the next speaker, please.
The next speaker is Daniel McQuaid. He's had 3 additional speakers yield time to him, so he would have 4 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you. Can you please show the deck, please? And you can hear me fine?
Yes, we can hear you, sir.
All right, thank you very much, Chair and Commissioners. My name is Dan McQuaid, and I'm speaking for my wife, Dana, my 11-year-old son, Jack. Can I go to slide number 8, please? Okay. We moved here to Raleigh about 6 years ago because we actually fell in love with the city. We saw that something was happening. We love downtown. We embrace urban living. That's been our whole life pretty much. But you know what brought us downtown was the downtown plan, which had a vision, spent tons of hours, people involved with it. We embraced it, and that's why we moved into downtown. When we look at what's happening in this district, you've already approved the Legends to 40. And now we're looking at a DX40 for this lot next door. What happens when across the street goes to DX12? You got a 40-foot street with, you know, bike lanes, and it just can't handle it. Could we go to slide 12, please? Okay, go back, go back, go back, go back there. This is the current residence right now. We have 66, as Wendy said, 208 right here. That's 274 residences in one city block. Please go to the next slide. That's more residents than this entire area of Boylan Heights, just for a reference. Next slide, please. Adding in what you already approved could be 300, could be 400. Another 40 story, that brings us to another 300 to 400. That's over 1,000 residences. Next slide. Perspective on density, there you go. Could we go to slide 14, please? So when we look at this plan that's before you and what you've already approved, as Wendy indicated, you have a 150-foot buffer at the Park Devereaux to the one that you approved already, the DX40 on the corner of Hargett and South Harrington Street. Next slide, please. That's the distance from borderline to the windows. Not a great impact. Next slide. Can we go to slide number 20, please? That is the Hue. That is the second building that's going to be going up at 301 Hillsborough. Right now, we're looking at on the north side of the Dawson. We only see garages because we're up 9 stories. We're at 5. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is how the Hue was built. There are no windows on the west side of that. And next slide, they have 135 feet for a parking deck. So there has been little to low impact of your zoning for that 40 at that point. Next slide, please. This is where we're currently at. Next slide. This is what is being proposed. And additionally, like Wendy said, right to the property line. Next slide, please. There's the windows. There are 16 bedrooms. Next slide, please. Next slide. Say hello to Dan. That's my Jack's son's bedroom. That is 7 feet away. This is a drone shot. There's a balcony. We'll be 5 feet away. Next slide. 100 light candles. When you go up 600 feet, we're not going to have any light. Next slide. That's my living room and dining room. Next slide. 100-foot candles. Next slide. There's a wall. Next slide. This is the Hue property garage, 12 feet away from the Legends property line. That's what we're going to be looking at if you go up. We're going to have that kind of a look. Next slide. As Wendy said, non-cooperative developer. Put in the power position, we're going to go right next door to you. Next slide. What happened to this plan? This is a defining decision for you as the commissioners. This is the first time you need to consider residential abutters 6 feet away from a 40-story building. Never mind the impact that's going on into the neighborhood. It's severe. I understand the 2030 comprehensive.
Mr. McQuaid, I just wanted to let you know that the time had expired. If you just want to finish your thought.
Yes, your role as the commissioner in the 2030 comprehensive plan, Chair, was to ensure Raleigh's goal of growing successful neighborhoods and communities. We need you to do the right thing. We're not lawyers. We didn't hire these big firms. How do we get representation? How do you hear us? How do you experience us? That's all we ask.
Thank you, sir. Do we have any additional speakers?
There are 2 more speakers. The next speaker is Chris Mutos.
Good morning, everyone. In the essence of respecting everybody's time, I will submit my letter to you all in lieu of speaking so that whoever else might want to speak can do so. And if there's
Thank
any
you,
time
sir.
left over, I'm happy to speak, but I can do it via email.
Thank you, sir.
Absolutely.
Our final speaker is Michael Gehring.
Good morning. My name is Mike Gehring, and I have a few comments just to give a little bit of a personal perspective. My wife and I moved from the historic district in Hillsborough, North Carolina, to the Dawson about 2.5 years ago. And we very much enjoy living in an urban environment here and want to see it improve. I generally favor high density and commercial development. For example, I supported and continue to support the Hillsborough 301 project across the street. However, we both oppose this rezoning application. The DX zoning requirements and standards are inappropriate for this parcel. They don't consider our situation at all. So I urge you to recommend denying this particular application. Instead, please add provisions to the UDO to adequately address residential development and urban living in our area. We have an amazing thing here. Please help us improve it. This rezoning is going in the wrong direction. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Was that the final speaker?
Yes, that was the last speaker.
Okay. Now I'd like to allow for questions and comments from commissioners. Do any members have any questions or comments? Commissioner Dautel?
Thanks, Chair Fox. I have maybe a couple of questions, but one thing that kind of strikes me as sort of driving a lot of the discussion here is the fact that there is so many homes and openings and balconies on this side of the building that is, from what I can tell, it's up against the lot line of the Dawson, which I am not sure how building code wise that was able to be constructed in that way. Maybe I'm misunderstanding something, but beyond the zoning case, I have a kind of building code issue with what I'm seeing in this case that gives me concern for the safety of the folks living in the Dawson. I don't know, maybe that has been addressed somehow. Maybe it wasn't, maybe the codes were different then, but that wasn't that long ago. So that's just, I'll just give that as a comment. I think, I have some concerns that it may not have been constructed properly, but I could be totally wrong. And I feel like if that was not the case, a lot of these issues would be resolved. And I also have a concern that, given the current zoning of DX12, that the issues that people have made their points pretty eloquently, and I totally understand them and understand their issue. A 12-story building pushed up against the lot line would not be, yeah, it'd be a little bit different than a 40-story building, but a lot of those issues that have been brought up would not go away even if it was a 12-story building. So I'm not sure if I have any questions, but those are kind of my initial thoughts and observations and concerns. I think in the spirit of working with the community, it seems like it might be a good idea for the developer to listen to the concerns and address some of those in terms of the buffering that could be accomplished there. But I'm not sure if that's something they're willing to address, but that's kind of what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Commissioner Dautel. I'm going to tag on to that a little bit. I was also confused at how the Dawson had such a high number of unprotected openings on that side. And I'm wondering if anyone from staff would be either on the line now or available to provide us with a little bit of information how the number of unprotected openings in the existing Dawson building would affect that facade of the proposed new building. Because I'm assuming it may mean that you don't get any openings on that side. I just want to know if someone could verify that for us.
Well, I am not sure that there's anyone on staff who remembers exactly what the approval process was like for this building, which would have gone through that in 2004, 2005 timeframe. It was certainly under an earlier generation of codes and an earlier generation of downtown development. When the UDO was adopted, the DX district gave explicit permission to build on the property line, as was often done in the heyday of downtown development, where buildings would present blank walls to each other and they would form sort of a joined party wall on the property line, and you would get a continuous connected set of street wall, even though the buildings were separate buildings, maybe even built at different times. Clearly, in this case, there's a lot of windows on that side facing the property line, and so if you put up a building with no setback next to it, you're going to block the views of all those windows, no matter what you put there. And the only remedy for that really is some additional setback, which is not a code requirement, but it's certainly something that you could ask to see, because there is a rezoning with the potential for conditions in front of you, if you think that's an impact that should be mitigated. I would think that more buildings being put up in the current environment would probably not be designed the way the Dawson is designed, with all those openings so close to the property line for precisely this reason. But again, when the Dawson was conceived of, it was a different era in downtown development under a different set of development standards. I cannot speak to building code issues as it relates to these openings because that's outside of my expertise.
Thank you, though, Ken. That's helpful. Commissioner Rains, I think I saw your hand as well.
Thanks, Chair Fox. Just a couple quick comments and suggested conditions. I agree with Commissioner Dautel and others said, if it's currently zoned to 12, the impacts are going to be the same, whether it's 20 stories or 40 stories in terms of light and views. To the Dawson, I recommend inclusion of public art and open space beyond typical site plan requirements. I do recommend that any site plan should go to the Appearance Commission, and as part of that, a shade study. We all know what's going to be, but I think a shade study would be beneficial for all involved to review as well. So those are my suggested conditions to add.
Thank you. Would the applicant like to respond to that?
On behalf of, hi, I can respond on behalf of the applicant. Thanks, Commissioner Rains and Commissioner Dautel. Those are helpful. I think we would be open to looking at those suggestions. I do want to clarify that the applicant does not, in any of the studies we've done, we are not proposing to build to the property line. So there would be a larger setback than that would be currently permitted by code. It's just because of the urban frontage, as you can imagine, the active uses are going to be facing the street, and any structured parking will be situated behind those uses adjacent to the Dawson. So we just have to maintain that footprint to be able to construct, but the setback would be larger certainly than permissible. The shade study, I mean, I just want to clarify with Commissioner Rains, you're suggesting that be committed to at the time there is a plan that's completed. So at this point, that would be at site plan, I guess. Okay, good. And then the open space we could look at further. Appearance Commission, it used to be that plans went automatically to Appearance Commission. I think Commissioner O'Hara has sat through many of those meetings, and now the Appearance Commission is no longer doing that. So I don't have an issue with that, other than are they set up to be the ones to review such a case?
Would staff be able to respond to that?
I'm sorry, I was still thinking through the implications of a shade study. Can you repeat the question?
Well, my question, Ken, was simply if we put it in a zoning condition, I would want it to be effective or triggered by doing the study once we have a site plan.
Well, I think the issue is, what do we do with the findings of the study? So you'll do a study based on the site plan, and it'll show some shade impacts. And unless there's language in the condition that sets some sort of standard for how high those impacts can be, the plan review staff could say, well, that's interesting information, but we have no way to act upon it. So we can disclose this information to the neighbors so they'll know what the shade impacts will be before the building is built. But we won't be able, it won't figure into the approval or denial of the plan unless there's a specific standard for the shade impact cannot be more than this amount for this amount of time of the day at this time of year. So I guess at this point, sitting where I am, it's not clear to me, even though obviously the shade impacts are real and of interest to the neighbors, it's not clear to me how to craft a condition that's enforceable at the time of site plan review. It would just be information that we would have that we could not act upon unless we can figure out that standard.
And if we did a study now, we would simply be looking at what could be built by right at the property line today versus some other hypothetical, I guess, of what post rezoning.
Just right, that's correct, unless of course you included a condition in the case that said that you would build to a larger setback than the minimum required by zoning, in which case the shade study would look at that massing.
Understood. Well, Commissioner Rains, if you had any more feedback on that, I appreciate it.
Yes, Mr. Bowers does bring up a good point. We don't have any good way to measure it and what the implications would be. So it would just be knowledge, but nothing that anybody could act on the planning or appearance commission. So I don't have an answer. And I don't know if the city has dealt with this before and applied conditions based on shade study findings or know of any other applications that we could derive conditions from. But so yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a recommendation, I guess, on that.
Right. I mean, I think the times I've seen some sort of standard for shade, it's been usually shade across parks, and the condition is in some way benchmarked about what's necessary for a healthy plant life in the park, that there's not too much shadow during certain times of the year, like where plants are starting to grow again, such as springtime. In this case, obviously with the potential today for 12, with the zoning up to 40 stories, very close to an adjacent building, there's potential for a lot of shade, and given the north-south orientation of the property line, or roughly north-south, because Raleigh's grid is not on a true north orientation, you're gonna find that for half the day, there's probably going to be a fair amount of shadow on the adjacent property, and then when the sun is on the other side of the building, there's not. I mean, I think that's the basic impact there. So I'm not really sure an involved study is going to tell us a whole lot. The sun rises in the east, and so as the sun is arcing across the sky, this is a west-facing wall. It's going to be in shade from its own wall when it's at high noon. It'll get a little bit of light, and then it'll be in shade from the adjacent building shortly thereafter. I think that's probably the likelihood. And the amount of light it gets will be very much dependent, maybe more, as much dependent on the setback as it is on the building height, but it's obviously somewhat dependent on the building height.
Thank you, Mr. Bowers. It does sound like the commission is interested in seeing additional conditions, perhaps related to public art, additional open space, a setback on the Dawson side, among some other items. Are there any other items we would like to address before we defer this case to allow the applicant time? Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair Fox. I'm curious, several of the people who spoke said the applicant had not been responsive. So I'm wondering, are there additional things that the neighbors have requested that aren't being addressed, that we haven't addressed either? Or is the nature of their request simply not to go up to 40 stories?
Would the applicant like to address that? And then also staff would like to follow up.
Well, I mean, certainly there's been a lot of interaction, meetings, and feedback. And I alluded to a number of the slides I think that Ms. Oppenheimer didn't get to in her presentation that laid out, as she mentioned, like maybe 30 or 40 potential suggestions, but many of them are design related. Some are about the loading, to respond to Ms. Bennett, which would not be adjacent to the Dawson. So some will be addressed by a matter of just the following the code and constructing. I think it's mainly trying to figure out, and I think the Planning Commission this morning has sort of drilled down to the substance of what could be done through conditions, because so much of what is at the heart of the concern is a big building being built next to them. And I completely understand that, given the way the Dawson was constructed and the fact you have all these windows on the west side. And so whatever is going to be built there creates an emotional toll, and we recognize that. And I think the challenge is to get to some meaningful conditions, which I think you're doing now and helping guide us so that we're not kind of going around about the fact there's a big building being built there.
This is Ira. I feel like that may have been a question for me. Would you mind repeating that, Commissioner Bennett?
Well, I was just wondering, I mean, we were giving direction to the applicant about conditions that could be added. And I just wanted to make sure we were getting all of them.
Okay.
And I guess I will say, Ira, before you respond, I think the bigger thing that I'm saying is there anything that they can really do that's going to make this acceptable to the neighbors or to the commissioners that have concerns? And if not, as I've said before, why even go through the motions of more time, have them spend more money, have us spend more time, when there's really nothing that, if you don't like the case, if the neighbors don't like the case, why even go through the exercise of doing more studies and creating more conditions? As I've said before, sometimes a no is just a no. And if it's a no, then let's just make it a no and not go through the exercise of wasting people's time.
Yes, ma'am. Okay. So for the second part of your question, I can't answer, what level would be acceptable. And like Ken said, I think a lot of the question, there isn't really a great guidance that we have anywhere in our codes or otherwise to offer you what is acceptable or not. Like a comparable, I can tell you what is a good amount of space for a street most times because we have standards for that and we know generally how wide vehicles are, et cetera. But how much shade is too much shade? I can't answer that question. In terms of what is in the realm of possible for the applicant to submit, setting aside the height issue, which is sort of the obvious one, the people have spoken of the setback. I think the shop front frontage requires that there be a building on 80% of their street frontage. So certainly they could guarantee that up to 20%, where the location of that alley was that Ms. Oppenheimer showed, that is room for them to have somewhere between 0 and 20% of their frontage could be a setback legally. There are also building massing standards in UDO in Chapter 3 that talk about a step back, which they are allowed to place anywhere between their 2nd and 12th story, I believe. And that is a certain feat. They could certainly go above and beyond those standards. And, even potentially talking about the location of where the tower is. So like Ken was saying, there's going to be a tall building there, probably under lots of different scenarios, but theoretically pushing that building maybe as far north and west as possible would preserve as much sun as possible. I can't answer if that is enough, but that is theoretically potential. There's also like a building floor plate for towers. So those are the standards in the code that they could add that might have some impact on light and views that most people are talking about. But again, I don't know if that's going to be sufficient. And then the other one is that extra, which has not come up today, was that third leg of the tripod of the parking deck requirements, which to date, I'll mention again, no one else has included, but has been discussed by the UDC anyway. Did that answer your question, Commissioner Bennett?
Yes, Ira, thank you.
Okay,
That was
great.
helpful.
Chair Fox, I unfortunately have to leave the meeting for another commitment. Travis Crane will take over my place as primary planning staff support.
Thank you. That's a good reminder as well. I just want to acknowledge Commissioner Miller had to drop off of the call due to another commitment. Do we have any other commissioners who will need to leave? I just need to check in on a quorum and how long we'll have one. Does anyone have a hard stop at 12:15 or 12:30? I have a 12:30 hard stop. Okay. All right. It looks like we can last until 12:30. We'll get through as much of this as we can. Circling back to Z5221, it sounds like there's an opportunity to craft additional conditions and that the applicant is interested in doing so. Without objection, I would like to defer this case to allow them to do so. Just a quick check-in with the applicant. Would that do you have enough time to be able to come back to the December 14 meeting, or would that be looking at January?
We'd certainly like to come back to December 14, but with the holiday coming, please, if staff would just clarify when we would need to submit those for you to consider on the 14th.
I believe that would be the 3rd, since we do have a 5th Tuesday in November. So it would be December 3rd. I would need new conditions.
Okay. So we have a week and a half.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Looks like there's a question from Commissioner Lampman and then from Commissioner O'Haver.
Thank you. I'm just following up on some of these historical approvals surrounding the parcel. I was wondering if I can just get an update on any permits or designs that have been submitted for Z1421. Did it go up to 40 stories? And then I'm also interested in Z5420. It looks like to the applicant, there might be some additional proposed conditions that could provide some sort of inspiration in terms of providing additional conditions. I don't know how relevant they are, but could be helpful. But I'm curious about what is, because we don't have context of existing buildings right now, I think that's also a bit of a challenge. So I'm just wondering where we are in the permitting process. Do you have designs that have been supplied? Can we look at those in conjunction so we can understand greater continuity in this area?
Would the applicant like to respond to that? And then we'll move on to the other commissioners' questions while we defer this item.
I would just say we looked at the conditions and included all those on recent cases in this area that you've heard. I can't speak to status of permitting on other projects, but that would be useful information, I think, if you get that.
I would like to see that from the planning department if we can get that. And I thought Z5420 had some additional conditions that were not included. Yes, you are consistent with Z1421 though, in terms of conditions.
If somebody would clarify that point, I think a lot of the Z54 were mimicking the urban frontage because they did not do an urban frontage. But if we missed something, I would be very interested in understanding what that is.
I believe they were as well. Did we have another question? I thought I saw another hand up. Commissioner O'Haver, Commissioner Bennett, Commissioner Rains. Commissioner O'Haver?
I just want to, I think we need to defer it. I don't want to run down the clock here. I just want to make the comment that it's sort of in a response to Ms. Bennett's point, because I agree sometimes a no is a no. But the other adage we always remind ourselves of is when we say no to something, we're saying yes to something else. And a 12-story by right is going to have the same issue. So I'd like to continue this conversation with both the applicant to try to find the best solution here, because it is unfortunate, the existing conditions. And I feel like if we just, move forward, and whether this gets approved or not approved, a 12-story by right is going to be potentially could be worse for the residents. So I'm encouraged to continue the conversations to try to find a solution. That's all I wanted to add.
Thank you. Commissioner Bennett?
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to ask if I was responding to Mr. Paul's statement about having a week and a half to get new conditions in so we can hear it at our December 14th meeting. Does that give time to work with the neighbors so the neighbors can see the new conditions?
Would the applicant like to respond to that?
We certainly would offer and have, and would meet with them prior to submitting.
Okay, thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you, that's helpful. Did I see another hand? Was Commissioner Rains, did you still have a comment?
Yes, thanks, Chair Fox. Just quickly, from the conversation, it sounds like what was presented to the neighbors is different than or what the neighbor interpreted was different than what the intended. I would ask, if possible, to do a massing model of what the true conditions that the applicant is intending to do to demonstrate their intended step backs, and maybe that would identify those specific step back height conditions for all of us, if that's possible, that the applicant could provide by the next meeting.
Would the applicant like to respond to that?
I believe that's possible. We have a number of massing models we have developed and shared and gotten feedback on, and we also have a by right massing model just for comparison purposes. So, Dean, I think we could have that.
That'd be
Great,
very
thank you.
helpful. So it sounds like we're going to allow the applicant additional time to craft some more conditions, and they will come back at the December 14th meeting. I'm going to acknowledge right now that it is 12:18. We have a number of other items, and you're going to lose me in 12 minutes, and I'm not quite confident that we'll get through a case in 12 minutes today, given our track record. So what I'm going to do is just proactively, I believe we're going to have to move these cases to our next meeting. They will show up on our agenda again. Those are items D5, D6, and D7, one of which is a city-initiated rezoning, which I believe may have had a number of speakers signed up to speak on. So I apologize to anyone who had to wait through the meeting. There are a number of cases we're dealing with. Okay. So those items are deferred. I'd like to move through with approval of the minutes. The draft minutes for the November 9th virtual meeting are included in the backup. Are there any edits or comments related to the minutes? Seeing none, I'd like to entertain a motion to approve the meeting minutes from November 9. Commissioner Rains?
I move to recommend approval of the meeting minutes of the Planning Commission from November 9th.
Thank you. And do we have a second? Commissioner Bennett?
Second.
Thank you. And then I will ask for a show of hands to record individual votes on approval of the minutes. And at the end of the vote, I'll announce the outcome. Those in support of approving the minutes? Right, any opposed? The motion passes unanimously. Moving on to report of the chairperson. I have no report today. Thank you. Then report of the members. Do any members have a report that might include proposals for meetings during December for committees?
Thank you. Yes, Jennifer Lampman, Chair of the Strategic Planning Committee. We have a meeting on December 9th at 4 o'clock. There we are inviting a discussion on policies for affordable housing. We also have a number of speakers, and I anticipate a robust conversation. So I'm really excited about that. Thank you for all of the committee members who participate on that committee. I'm looking forward to this one. I hope you will as well. I'd also like to defer to Ira to help on some of the prior meeting items that may need to be motioned out of the Planning Commission.
Sure. There were 3 pending items, I believe. Hold on, I will find my list of stuff. But one was discussed most recently in very early 2020 when Bob Geary was chair of the commission. That was affordable housing and zoning conditions. So that I think was discussed twice. And never concluded because we stopped having meetings because of COVID. The other two items, one was about access to businesses during construction. That was formally referred by the commission at the request of, I believe, Commissioner Hicks at the time. And then the third was about policies in the depot district. This was shortly after the rezonings of the Russ Bus and CAM sites. So those two have not been discussed. And so it is, that I believe in the next report of if the chair and the rest of the strategic planning committee does not have any interest to move forward with those, they can report on the next planning commission with no recommendation back to the full commission. That would be the proper way to close those items.
If I may ask of our chair, if I can just do a quick poll offline, and then on the next one, I'll vote those out.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Do any other members have a report? Okay, seeing none. Do not believe we have a committee of the whole meeting at a regularly scheduled time because it is Thanksgiving. I'm going to move on to report of the Deputy Planning Director, Mr. Crane. I think you're on mute. This is like a fantasy I'm living out right now where Travis can't talk.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Oh, great. Thanks. Sorry to spoil your fantasy. Given the lateness of the hour, I would just note that there's a report in your backup material that goes through the cases that the City Council has considered and acted upon. So if you have questions about that, just please feel free to reach out to staff.
Excellent, thank you. Mr. York?
Yes, just real quick. Just wanted to confirm that the cases that we didn't get to that are being deferred to December 14th.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that clarification.
And happy Thanksgiving to everyone.
Thank you, Mr. York. Is there anything else for the good of the order? No? Have a great Thanksgiving, everybody. This concludes this meeting of the Planning Commission. Thank you.